We are now changing into another era, the Cenozoic, the time of recent life. This is the point at which we start seeing a lot of creatures that are essentially modern in their anatomy and their morphology. A lot of groups that we know of are either already present or will shortly be present on Earth. You know, things like primates are coming around at this point. This is the age of mammals. We see the massive radiation of animal groups, of mammals, especially mammal groups, into the air, into the seas, on land, all sizes eventually. Very rapid diversification. We see lots of diversification in the Cenozoic with insects and, of course, plants, big time. Let's stop first and let's sort of take a look at, you know, we're at the KT boundary here with this map. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics of the whole globe at this point. All right, number one, what do you notice about the colors of the continents here? And what do they tell you? Say again? There's a lot of plants. Yeah, it's a very green, very lush environment. Can compare and contrast the relative green that you see in, say, somewhere like Alaska or Greenland, right? It was always wondering, why do they call it Greenland? Well, maybe they named it based on what it looked like during the Cretaceous. It's actually not true, is it? But can compare, say, Greenland to somewhere like Australia or China. Can you see any differences? Yeah. The darker greens probably reflect more tropical, right? Now look at Alaska. It's pretty dark green, right? Yeah. So from this time period of Alaska and shortly thereafter, we have palm trees and we have crocodilians, crocodiles, alligators. So that tells you a lot about what the temperature was like at the Arctic Circle, right? It's very much tropical. What is missing currently from this landscape? Glaciers. Now, there are glaciers present, but there are not polar ice caps. What glaciers would have been present would have been where? High mountains. Yeah, the glaciers you would expect in very high mountain ranges above 20, 25,000, 30,000, yeah. No mountain range is 30,000, but above 20 to 25,000 feet, you would have expected glaciers in places like some of the higher ranges of mountains. Now, keep in mind, at this point, the Himalayas do not exist. The Rocky Mountains are still in a state of infancy. The Appalachian Mountains are worn down very much so by this point. The Andes Mountains do not exist. There are other mountain ranges on Earth, but most of those mountain ranges are either eroding down or soon to be eliminated, soon to be like eroded flat. And there will be certainly other ranges that will come up. And that, my friends, is going to be a major part of the story of the Paleogene period and into the Neogene, is the when and where mountain ranges form. We'll come back to that. All right. Now let's take a look at the location of the key continents, okay? A lot of the continents are beginning to sort of assemble in their modern configuration. They're roughly at their approximate latitude. Notice the equator is about where it is today. But there are some very key differences. Let's point out some of those differences. Number one, there is no Central America and Southern Mexico, and nor will there be. From this date at 66 million years, it'll be another almost 3 million, 3 to 5, maybe 3 to 10 million years before there's actually a fully connected landmass that connects North and South America. That actually officially doesn't happen until 3 million years ago. So that means then there's a wide open swath. And that also means that North America and South America's land mammals and plants are effectively isolated from one another, with the exception of things like birds, right? Or spiders, which can float in the jet stream. Certain plants might achieve long distance dispersal, but not much. That depends on wind currents. Okay? You'd probably be more likely to spread from Africa to South America as a plant with a fluffy sea than you would, say, from South America to North America, based on wind currents alone. Now I want you to notice that there is no polar ice cap, like Kiki said, and instead you have a fairly connected southernmost chain of continents: Antarctica and Australia and Papua New Guinea, Tasmania, New Zealand. They're all connected as sort of one landmass, and it's completely tropical. There are forests down there. There are dinosaurs down there. There are mammals. It's very healthy and lush, just like anywhere else in the world. Okay. All right. With that, and by the way, those continents, of course, those are the ones that still have the most change yet to come. From North America and Europe and Asia and Africa, they're still moving a little bit, sure. There's still parts of those continents that are being built, like the coastal plain of North America and Central America. But in terms of the movements of their actual positions, India, Australia, especially those, are the ones that are going to still change dramatically over the next 30 million years. And those changes, believe it or not, have worldwide ramifications. Would you believe me if I told you that one of the things that leads us to shift from a tropical rainforest condition here in Tennessee 70 million years ago to having a temperate climate? Actually, most of that has to do with Australia and Antarctica. Because eventually, as you're going to see, Australia is going to break away through rifting. And once it does, poor old Antarctica is going to be all by its lonesome. And what that's going to lead to is a change up in ocean currents. And that change up will eventually lead to a change in worldwide climate. We'll come back to that. Okay. So,
Question.
yes.
Did I hear you say, yeah, did I hear you say that at that time, on those continents down there, there were dinosaurs still with the lush growth?
Absolutely. Almost anything you can think of that we had, they had as well. Yeah, there was a very thriving environment in Antarctica. And all the fossils of those are there, buried under the ice.
Okay, but not in this Cenozoic era that we're...
No, we're in, yeah, well, I'm just giving you an example from the late Cretaceous, because that's when that's dated. But that would have, the dinosaurs would have gone extinct exactly at 65.5 million years.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then we had things like giant flightless birds, right? Things like some of the relatives of the emus and the ostriches. They lived on, very likely would have lived in Antarctica as well. Okay. Now, I want to change up a little bit, because not only do we have the Earth beginning to be, the continents beginning to sort of arrive at their modern day configuration, more or less, right? Secondly, we now also have many of the same organismal groups, right? Primates, mammals are here. It's actually been said, and I don't know how exactly true this is, but a paleobotanist once wrote that probably most of the modern genera of plants that we have, so think about like oak trees, right? That's the genus Quercus. Hickory trees are the genus Caria. It's been said that for most of those, the genus likely was already evolved by 70 million years ago in the late Cretaceous. So for most genera that you see out there today, they probably were already here, at least in terms of plants, by 70 million years ago. All right, so that's the second thing I want you to think of. Most of the major groups of organisms either were evolving or kind of already recognizable by the end of the Cretaceous. One more thing. For most ecosystem types, let's actually back it out. Let's call them biome types. For most biome types, they were also in existence by the end of the Cretaceous. What do I mean by that? Tropical rainforest was in existence. Dry, fire-dominated pine savannas, or let me say it another way. Dry, pine-dominated woodlands and forests were in existence. Swamplands were in existence, right? These major vegetation types based on sort of broad characterizations. Prairies, though, and grasslands did not exist because grass had only just evolved. So in terms of a whole ecosystem being grass dominated, it was not a thing yet. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to stop and let's review some basic stuff, probably from like, I don't know, high school, maybe freshman biology, but I want to review the world's biome types. Raise your hand if you've studied a map of the world's biomes. Okay. Just give me an idea when you had that. Just refresh my memory. You had it last semester as part of what class? Physical geography. Okay. Who else? Clayton? Dendrology at another school?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. As part of dendrology. Yeah. You had in ecology this semester. Who teaches that? With Dr. Haas. Okay, awesome. So it sounds like most of you were picking this up in your first year or two of college. Anybody have this in high school? Matthew, Jaron, several of you? Okay. We probably even had this back in middle school and elementary to some extent. I think we get this sprinkled. This is like one of those topics they come back and hit you with 5 times before you go to college, right? But I remember being a young college student at the University of Tennessee as a grad student. And I was like, I don't really know my biomes. I don't really know what a mangrove swamp biome is. I don't think I really exactly know what an alpine tundra is compared to just a tundra, you know? So let's just briefly review. Here's why. Because all these biomes now are either already in existence or about to be in existence, a big part of the next 70 million years is talking about how those biomes begin to shift. Keep in mind what we focused on so far in this class. What do we start with, guys? Call them out in order. Number 1, rocks. Number 2, soil. Number 3, landforms. Number 4, ecoregions or physiography, right? And 5, kind of how it all began to evolve and take shape as a continental landmass, right? And we're kind of finishing that up. Now that you know how the land sort of came into being, it was assembled and formed. Now what we need to do in this section is begin to overlay, because we're not done telling that story. But now we need to finish and add on various complex overlays. So while the land is finishing up taking its modern shape over the next 65 million years, all the way to the Holocene, what was the climate doing? So we're going to add that overlay, okay? What was the vegetation doing? We're going to add that overlay. What were the animal groups as they were evolving? We're going to add that overlay. And then in about a week and a half, we're going to start about a 2-week period, hopefully maybe less. And we're going to look at the human overlay, right? When people come to North America for the first time, Native Americans, all the way through Europeans, that to me is a fun section. But now we're going to focus on these key biomes. So let's talk about that. So number 1, you should know there are lots of different biome maps. Many of them are contradictory. We're not going to get into a study of the differences of who said what and he said, she said. What I am going to do, though, is just kind of point out one example of these discrepancies. So here's a biome map, which I just stole off of Google Images from somewhere. And I want you to focus on the eastern United States, right? And lower Canada. Here, this is called eastern temperate forest. If you look on another biome map, though, they differentiate out the southeastern coastal plain as a southern evergreen forest, mostly because of how much pine it has down there. So that's just a simple examination of a key difference where they may not totally agree. Other authors may not agree on where does the prairie begin and end, right? Notice this guy right here shows prairies extending all the way into Illinois, Indiana, but here they show them largely as west of the Mississippi River. So you should just know these come with the territory of biome maps. It's okay. Now, I will say that some of the latest biome maps have actually begun to completely remap the Southeast. And then now, instead of showing the area as deciduous forest or as coniferous forest, because both of those imply that it should be a forest condition, some of the latest biome maps are shifting that. and saying that large sections of the east actually were part of a grassland biome. So that's a key thing to think of. One final consideration. We're going to start at the north end, up in the Arctic. We're going to rapidly go through. I'm just going to make this rapid fire because most of you have had it. This is just meant to be a quick refresher. We're going to start at the north at the Arctic zone, and we're going to go down to the tropics. So hang on, here we go. We're going quick, all right? As we go, I want you to call them out when you see them, when they come up. Somebody call it out. Polar ice, right? That makes sense to us. The Greenland ice cap, places like northernmost Canada up near the North Pole, right? Tundra. Say it loud with me, tundra. All right, good deal. Now, tundra taiga transition zone, okay? That's not its own biome. That's the borderland between the taiga, which is the coniferous forest across most of northern Canada, and the tundra zone to the north. So this line that separates the two is called what? It's actually called the tree line. And if you're at it's an important thing to know though, where is the tree line? By the way, you could trace tree line all around the northern hemisphere, through Norway and Sweden, into Russia and Finland, all the way through Siberia, into Alaska, through Canada, Iceland. There's a tree line, and that represents the northernmost edge of the coniferous forest, which you're looking south across it. The tundra is from there back to the north. Yeah.
What is the elevation line? And also a tree line?
It is. So this is a tundra. This is a tree line in true tundra, which is because the soils are frozen, right? You have permafrost. And what you're describing is tree line on the top of a mountain or the side of a mountain. And that's the alpine tundra zone. So that's a different zone, but that's important. Now we go into taiga or boreal forest. All right, coniferous forest, mostly spruce trees and fir trees, jack pine here in North America. Lots of bogs, these open wetlands. Temperate broadleaf and mixed forest. These are both areas with temperate broadleaf trees, scattered with a few coniferous trees like white pine and hemlock trees, spruce trees occasionally, but mostly hardwood and broadleaf trees. These are areas compared to the boreal forest, where there's very boreal climatic conditions, very cold. Here we have warmer, more seasonal conditions like a definite spring, summer, winter, and fall, right? We have temperate grasslands, savannas, and shrublands, places like the Great Plains of the United States and Canada. In the high mountains of the Rockies and in a few areas of New England and eastern Canada, we have alpine grasslands, montane grasslands, and shrublands. So this is basically alpine tundra. And you can see alpine tree line right there, a point at which trees cannot really grow above. We have temperate coniferous forests. These are in the temperate zone, so they have spring, summer, winter, fall, but they actually happen to be very fire-dominated landscapes. So the trees that you see here, like these longleaf pines, are very much adapted to frequent fire, so they're very open, and there's a grassland on the ground level. These happen to be kind of difficult to assign. Do you call it a forest? Do you call it a grassland with trees? There's still a lot of debate about that. You have flooded grasslands and savannas, places like the Everglades of South Florida. Mangrove swamps. It's a small biome, but it's important, right up against the coast. Places like the coast of Honduras and Nicaragua, parts of coastal Mexico, the Everglades of Florida has mangrove swamps. As you get into the desert regions of Southern California and the Southwest, into large swaths of Mexico, you have a very short stunted shrubland, which we call chaparral. And these areas often have what's called a Mediterranean climate, very similar to parts of Italy, North Africa, South Africa, or parts of Western Australia, parts of Chile as well. Then we have tropical and subtropical grasslands. These occur in the southernmost tip of Florida in a few places. but mostly these would be in parts of Central America, and especially in South America. A lot of the grasslands like the Cerrado of Brazil, the Llanos of Venezuela and Colombia. Lots of deserts. We have both warm deserts and cold deserts, the Chihuahuan, Sonoran, Great Basin, Mojave deserts. And then as you get into the mountains of Mexico, subtropical and tropical coniferous forests. So these are in a tropical, subtropical climate. Otherwise, they're pine dominated, a grassy floor, mostly in the mountains. You can imagine fires just moving through those mountains, just burning the grassland layer on the ground. Tropical and subtropical dry broadleaf forests. These are forests in places like on the west coast of Costa Rica or the west coast of Mexico, where it's tropical, so you don't have cold temperatures, but the forest here drop their leaves every year. We drop our leaves every year because of winter dormancy, right? Cold temperatures. Here, they drop their leaves because of dry conditions. They go through a dry period. They have a monsoonal climate where the rainfall has a distinct wet and dry season. And so in this case, you have tropical deciduous forests. And then finally, tropical rainforest and subtropical rainforest. Now, again, why did I race through those? Because I don't really want to go back over and ensure that you know your biomes, right? I just want to just kind of put them back in your head a little bit. Because over the next rest of this hour and going through Thursday, we're going to begin to spend a lot of time looking at where was subtropical forest 70 million years ago? Where was temperate forest 50 million years ago? And how did it begin to shift and change to give us our modern ecosystems that we see today? Let me stop there as we get ready to begin the Cenozoic, the Paleocene era, and see if you have any questions about anything that I just went through. Okay. All right. Now, we're at 60 million years ago. The beginning of the Paleocene really is 65.4 million years ago, whatever. And the Paleocene, remember I said I wanted you guys to generally know the epoch beginning and end dates for the epochs of the Paleogene, Neogene, and Quaternary, okay? I'll be honest with you. I don't know them myself, the beginning and end dates. Now, if you said, hey, Dr. Estes, tell me when the Paleocene was. I'll say, hey, you know what? That was like 58 to about 65 million years ago. Somebody look me up on that. I don't know if that's accurate. See, when is the Paleocene?
The cover of the book says 66.
All right, what's the dates, beginning and end?
It just says 66 next to Paleocene. And then 56 on Eocene.
Oh, okay. What did you say, Brandon? 66 to 56. All right. So, from the top of the dome, I came up with what I say, 68 to, or 58 to 66, 65. It just needs to be approximate there, right? Nobody's going to really give a shit if you're off a couple million years. Now, wait a minute. Let me clarify. If you get to the Quaternary period and you're off by 2 million years, you've totally missed the whole period, right? Because it began 2.5 or 2.6 million years ago. So yeah, there's some you need to be a little bit more finessed on. But just know the approximate, guys. That's really what I'm looking for, okay? This is one of those moments where in your, I don't like to force you to memorize stuff, but if you'll just memorize those beginning and end dates, you'll have the approximate there. That's all I need. If you can do that, you're in good shape. Okay, let's talk about land bridges, okay? At 60 million years ago, the connections from North America to other continents are made through land bridges. We all know what land bridges are, right? We've been hearing about land bridges all our life. We've probably heard about the Central American land bridge. That one's not even in the picture until 3 million years ago. The only ones we have to contend with now are three. There's one that is the Bering Land Bridge, which is going to open and close many times over the next 60 million years. Most recently, it will open roughly 20,000 years ago, maybe up to 40,000 years ago, as Native Americans would have made their way across from Siberia into Alaska. That's one route taken at least. We also have two different routes, one through northern Canada into northern Greenland, on over into northernmost parts of, that would probably northernmost Russia. And then we have a route that would have taken us through southern Greenland, through northern Canada, through southern Greenland, over through the island of Svalbard, that's Svalbard, into Norway and Sweden, down through Europe that way. Those were all three very important land bridge connections, which facilitated the movement of both plants and animals for a few tens of millions of years. All right, let's switch gears now and let's talk a bit about one of the key ways that we know what the climate was like of North America over the past 70 million year period. That's really the focus of the next sort of week of class, is how do we know what the climate was like? Well, one key way that we know is through fossils, okay? The comparative method of studying fossils sort of allows us to say, and it doesn't always work, but generally speaking, if we have modern day examples, let's say, that are morphologically and anatomically, we can see and study. If we have similar analogs at some point that are very similar to them, one conclusion you can draw is that maybe the climate was similar for, if the vegetation exhibited similarities. So by using, for example, this tulip poplar leaf. Today, tulip poplars are a state tree here in Tennessee. It's common on campus. But yet this leaf is from 50 to 55 million years ago, from the Eocene epoch. And this cone, this is the type of fruiting structure of a magnolia. You can literally walk out here and go by the library, bend down underneath the tree, pick that magnolia cone up, put it right beside it, and it looks identical. 50 million years, right? So by studying that, we can say, hey, you know what? This ancient tulip poplar leaf, same shape, looks identical. It's roughly the same size, length to width. And if we do that with enough species, we see patterns begin to emerge, right? But what if we went and we saw that the leaves from that period were very different from today? Maybe they were giant leaves. Maybe maybe the leaves never had any teeth on the margins, but they were very smooth edged. Okay, versus in another region, the teeth are very jagged on the edge. These can tell paleobotanists some very important things. And guess what? They can inform us about climate. And one of the ways that we do climate reconstructions for the past 70 million years is using fossils of plants and animals, in addition to some other forms of evidence, which we'll cover. All right, so let's talk about this real quick. Plant megafossils versus microfossils. Megafossils are things like leaves and cones and branches and twigs and wood. Microfossils are things that are microscopic, like pollen grains, okay, for example. Seeds could be, depending on how small, could be examples of microfossils as well. Fragmentary leaf tissue could be examples of microfossils. There are three factors that are going to determine, though, whether they're going to be represented in the geologic record. Remember how we talked about time and time again, the reason we don't have any Jurassic fossils, because we were mountainous here, right? There's no depositional basin. So number one, whether an area is going to have fossils is going to depend on if it's connected to a depositional basin, a floodplain or a swamp, a pond, right? Those are where we have to look for paleobotanical fossils and paleofaunal remains as well. We also have to look at the durability of the organ. Really giant leaves do not preserve. They break up and fragment and decay. So there's a bias in the fossil record away from those kinds of fossils. They don't exist. Things with soft body parts, they decay and rapidly decay as well. So we need to look for, we need to know about those biases, and those are well understood if you want to go into the fossil record. the weight to area ratio of the organ also has to do with how well it fossilizes. Now, this is just a summary map that shows the location of fossils from the Paleogene time period for a large swath of North America, as well as the late Cretaceous. So here the blue stars are late Cretaceous age, roughly 70 million years. The Paleocene, roughly 60 to 65 million years by the red stars. And then the yellow stars indicate Eocene aged stuff. I do not have on here, but I'll show you later. What comes after Eocene? You guys, man, we've been too long in class for you not to know off the top of the head. What is it? Oligocene. All right, got to know that. All right. Now, let's just take a look at Alabama, at how these epochs of the former tertiary period, or what we call the Paleogene, Neogene, relate. In Alabama, these are kind of stacked, like with the most recent deposits of the Quaternary age down here. We have the Pliocene in pink, what's called the Citronella Formation. You don't need to remember that. I want you just to kind of note the ages of the epoch space. Pliocene is pink. The lime green here is Miocene. Oligocene next, followed by the Eocene, a couple layers of Eocene here. And then finally, we have this group right here is Paleocene, and then we get to Cretaceous. So we're going from young to old. In Alabama and southern Mississippi, those are well exposed, but we do not have any Pliocene, Miocene, or Oligocene rocks exposed, let's say, in West Tennessee. The only reason we have them, keep in mind that the coastal plain boundary at the time the dinosaurs went extinct, right, was that is the innermost edge of the coastal plain at the fall line. From 65 million years ago, this is where that coastline was, the fall line. In fact, this ecoregion here is known as the Fall Line Hills. Remember that? What's going to happen now from 65 million years ago all the way up to the present? The coastline steadily recedes. That's what creates these bands, okay? So at 66.5 million years ago, Cretaceous line, the fall line is here. Then the ocean levels drop, and we have the Paleocene formation that's forming in this sort of swampy landscape right here. That one continues all the way up into westernmost Kentucky. This band goes all the way up. Then we have these two levels of Eocene. They too go all the way up to Kentucky. They form these concentric bands. Okay? So by the time we get to 60 million years ago, the ocean levels have dropped a little bit down to about right here. By the time we get to 50 million years ago, ocean levels have dropped to here. At 45 million years ago, they've dropped to here. Now we get to the Oligocene, which comes next. At about 35 million years ago, the coastline's right in through here. Miocene starts 20 to 5 million years ago. So you have this very ragged sort of coastline in here. And then finally, the Pliocene is from 5 to 2 million years ago, and you have your coastline here. So the coastline of North America became almost what it is by about 2 million years ago. By the end of the Pliocene, the coastline's like right in here. It's in that final little bit when we hit the Quaternary period, the ice ages, is when we see the remainder of the coastline assume its modern position. Okay? So if you want to look for Oligocene fossils, it won't do you any good to go too far to the north or the south. You got to hit that Oligocene band. You got to hit that Pliocene band if you want Pliocene fossils from 2 to 5 million years ago, right? Now, here's some rocks in South Alabama along the Chattahoochee River. There's a little bit of a layer of clay here. These clay formations in these river bluffs are great places to, if you're a professional paleontologist, paleobotanist, to find fossils. And there's one of the examples right there. You remember that first day of class I passed around that clay stone that had that fossil in it? That comes from a really pure clay mine out just west of Paris, Tennessee. That's from the Eocene epoch. Okay. Now, so let's imagine then that you're a paleobotanist doing a cool job, Kian, like hanging off the side of that cliff, and you got your harness on, you know, you're rappelling. How cool of a job would that be, by the way? You know, you got your little rock hammer, you got your little chisels and your brushes, and what you're doing is you're excavating layers out of that clay, and you're looking at and observing leaves that have been there for 62, 63 million years, have never seen the light of day since. Isn't that cool? Since the very moment they were buried in the sediments from an ancient river or an ancient coastline. So what do you do with those leaves if you're a paleobotanist and you want to know, was this area tropical rainforest? Was this area a temperate broadleaf forest? Was it a temperate coniferous savanna of pine? Or was it a grassland? Those, my friends, or was it a tundra, right? All of those are possibilities for the Mid-South region, depending on what time period we look. If you look, for example, how many of you have been to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, right? If you look at the mountain slopes above Gatlinburg at 18,000 years ago, it was tundra above 3,000 feet elevation. If you go to Clarksville, Tennessee at 25,000 years ago, it was likely taiga. Remember taiga? Boreal forest, 25,000 years ago. If you go to the bluffs of the Mississippi River at 16,000 years ago, prairie on the top of the bluff. And finally, if you go to the valley of the Tennessee River, let's say 10,000 years ago, probably deciduous forest. You can do the same kinds of mental exercises depending on how far back in time you want to go. And what I want you guys to know by the time we get through this lecture is if somebody says to you, hey, what do you think, man? You think tropical rainforest was here in Tennessee 65 million years ago? What kind of evidence do you have? Well, you'll be able to point to the evidence because you're going to know. It's going to be in your brain, right? And you're going to be able to tell them, not only do I know it was tropical rainforest, but I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to blow your mind as to exactly the processes happening on Earth that involve Antarctica, the rise of the Rocky Mountains, the rise of the Himalaya Mountains, the change of the change of the jet stream, air currents, the change of the ocean currents. My friend, oh yeah, and the connection of the Central American Isthmus of Panama. Those are all major events that led to us changing from tropical rainforest to temperate deciduous. I'm going to show you how they're all connected. Okay, but back to the question at hand. We want to use what's called the modern analog method, the nearest living relative, or what's called NLR analogy. That's what I was saying earlier. You want to look at the modern nearest living relative. Where does it grow? What kind of ecological circumstances does it thrive in? Then, by looking across multiple species, then it tells you a little bit about what the historical or prehistoric conditions might have been like. Okay. To do this, we classify, and I do not want you memorizing this stuff, right? You don't even have to take notes on the slide. I just want you to watch it and look at it. To do this, we want to broadly classify leaf types according to what their foliar physiognomy is. And we want to look at several broad classifications. Megaphylls are giant leaves like palm fronds and cycad fronds. Then we have macrophylls. And notice that, sure, there's an area, square centimeter cutoff for these. That's just so we can quantify. Macrophylls would be like a magnolia leaf or a pawpaw leaf. These are like shady understory trees in deciduous forests. Okay? These are tropical forests. Next, we have what's called a mesophyll, a middle-sized, meso means middle, a mid-sized leaf. We might expect that to be in a subtropical deciduous forest or a temperate deciduous forest with warmer climates, like a warm temperate zone, very much like Tennessee. That, in fact, is a slippery elm leaf. Then we go to a notophyll, below 45 square centimeters. The farther north you go, birch trees, alder bushes, these have notophils, slightly on the small side. Now we get to a microphyll, smaller, nanophyll, and a leptophyll, which is something you might expect in desert or scrubland or chaparral type ecosystems. Now, if it's just one species that you're studying, that really doesn't give you a full, appreciation for what the entire collection of different leaf fossils of different species would be. So as a paleobotanist or paleoecologist, you would hope to find a fossil site that has 52 species represented in the fossil collection, right? Plus some animals and maybe some snails, some vertebrates and some invertebrates. Then you get to see the whole picture. You can't often do it with just one or two unless they're really characteristic. Okay. Another thing that we look for is the margins of the leaves. How many of you, raise your hand if you've ever had a botany class of any type? Oh man, my friends, we're gonna have to get y'all up in here in some botany classes. Unfortunately, I don't know if I'm gonna be teaching botany in the next near future. So you might have to go get you some botany skills from somebody. All right, but you don't need them, not for what we're doing. Who needs botany, right? I am a botanist, by the way. So one thing we want to look for is the margin of the leaf, because the margins can tell us a lot. Is the margin what we call smooth or entire margin without any teeth or lobes? Is it toothed, or does it have dissections or lobes? We can look at the relative percentages. Let's say we do have a fossil flora of 55 species in one cliff face, right? In a shale deposit. We can look at the percentage of those that have an entire margin, smooth edge. What are the percent that are non-entire or toothed or lobe? So take a look at this comparison between eastern central North America, temperate forest, compared to the Amazon lowlands of Brazil. All right. For trees, and this is based on modern day comparisons, right? For trees, just 10% have entire leaves versus in the Amazon, 90% entire. Shrubs, 14%, 87% in tropical environments in the tropical rainforest. Woody vines, 13%, 88% of woody vines in the Amazon rainforest. So entire margins are highly correlated with tropical conditions. Okay. Then let's look at the margin. A non-entire margin, meaning with teeth or lobes, is very common in a temperate forest. Elms and hackberries and hop hornbeams and birches, they all have jagged edges. Hickory trees. But how many of those have tooth or lobe margins in the tropics? Just about 10, 12, 13%. So that's a really good indicator as to tropical conditions or temperate conditions right there. In addition to like how much rainfall? Well, you would expect more rain equals bigger leaves. Drier, harsh, desert, or arid, small leaves. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but this is just a general comparison of many different areas as to the percentage of entire leaves. And you can see that all these tropical areas like the Philippines, Malaya, Malaysia, Philippines, West Indies have very high rates, over 75% with percent entire or smooth margin leaves. This then translates into what we call these different sort of types of designation of forests, like tropical rainforest or paratropical, which is kind of another word for like subtropical. Now, another thing we can do, and I'm just hitting the highlights here just so you'll have sort of expand your knowledge base a little bit. Paleobotanists can also perform what's called a stomatal analysis. Y'all know what stomata are, right? Those are the pores on the surface of a leaf. They're important for gas exchange, for photosynthesis, and stomatal density. So if you look at the left, the same area of leaf, there's a micron marker there, 20 micrometers. shows greater density of stomata on the leaf on the left compared to the one on the right, okay? These preserve on leaf fossils. So you could take a fossilized leaf from 50 million years ago, pop it under a microscope, and see the stomatal density. What does it mean, though? That's the key. Stomatal density increases with increases in carbon dioxide. The more carbon dioxide concentration, the greater density. The less carbon dioxide, the more sparse that they are. This gives us some idea of the linkage between, from a vegetation standpoint, between carbon dioxide and temperature range. So if it has high levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for example, what would you expect? The more carbon dioxide, what would you expect about temperature? It's going to be warmer, right? That's the whole greenhouse effect. So if it's warmer, you might also expect more moisture, not necessarily, depends. And if it's more moisture, you expect bigger leaves. So if you have bigger leaves and a greater stomatal density, those tell you about the climatic conditions of the area. Here's a general diagram that shows the close correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide over the past 350,000 years. There's a very tight, close correlation. Notice the big peaks and the valleys here that we see. Okay. So as we go forward in this, especially next week, we're going to begin looking at, and I'm going to throw out some of those terms like paratropical rainforest or tropical rainforest or temperate deciduous forest. I may also mention those terms: mesophyll, notophyll, megaphyll. I'm going to use them very loosely. Again, just look at those, study them a little bit, but don't do any deeper than what we've covered here. We're just going to fold it into our developing story. All right. Any questions about that? We've got about 8 minutes left. I'm going to keep going for just a bit. We'll see if you have any questions. Okay. All right. Now, I kind of alluded to this earlier. Sometimes I get ahead of myself. Let's look at the major Earth forces that are going to be important in telling this story. Okay. I already mentioned some of these. Number one, uplift of the Rocky Mountains. That's going to be a major game changer for North America's vegetation and ecosystems. Secondly, who would have thunk it, right? All the way around the world, who would have thought that the uplift of the Himalaya Mountains would impact us here in the United States? But they do in big ways. Now, this wasn't today. This was 50 to 45 million years ago, but it had a big impact. Those two forces, when you get those huge mountain ranges uplifting like that, all of a sudden, Mount Everest is at 29,000 feet elevation. That's almost up there with the jet stream. So they definitely then have the ability to impact the currents of the jet stream. And surface air currents are affected by these massive mountain ranges. One of the reasons why Southern California is devastated every so many years by these wildfires, particularly has to do with, it's a combination of several factors, but one of the big factors are the Santa Ana winds that blow in off of the Pacific. These very, almost like hurricane force, just gales that just blow, and they go right through the mountain passes east of Los Angeles. And they blow and carry the winds like over toward Las Vegas or something, right? The ability for those to move through the mountains because of those mountain passes, it just gives you a slight example of the impact of mountains on wind currents. But now think about like the Himalayas, how they restrict airflow coming in off the Indian Ocean into places like China. On one side, like Bangladesh and Nepal and northern India, you have lots of rainfall. And in fact, it's not uncommon every 10 years or so to hear of devastating, floods that kill tens of thousands of people, along the Ganges River and some of the rivers that flow off the Andes. But what's it like on the other side of the mountain? It's dry. It's in a rain shadow, right? You got eventually on the other side of the Tibetan Plateau, you have multiple deserts, the Gobi Desert being one of them. So rain shadows form because of adjacent mountain ranges. What can those do? Well, when mountain ranges uplift and it creates a rain shadow on the other side, what happens if that whole area before the mountains uplifted was forested from coast to coast? It can sever the forest, right? All of a sudden now, those forests can actually retract, and where they can divide into two giant blocks. It can create allopathic speciation events. You know, that's a big driver of evolution, right? When you start splitting those big chunks of forest. And so we think that prior to the mid-tertiary, or let's say prior to the Oligocene, large swaths of America, from North Carolina on the east to Washington State and Oregon on the west, it's thought that it was one massive deciduous forest, much like you see here. But something caused the fragmentation or the fracturing of that forest, and that something has to do with the rise of mountain ranges and the formation of rain shadows. Another key factor in our final 4 minutes, I'll just go all the way here. Plate tectonics. As we've been seeing, continental drift has a big effect. But remember what I said about Australia. When Australia breaks away from Antarctica for the first time since the breakup of Pangaea, what is Antarctica doing now at 50 million years ago? It's beginning to freeze. And that freeze is largely driven by one major worldwide factor. When Australia breaks away and Antarctica breaks away from South America, it changes ocean currents. So we've been talking about air currents changing because of these mountain ranges, right? Now we're talking about ocean current changes. And so this very cold current, like if you were to go off the coast of Los Angeles, that water is very cold. It's coming south from Alaska, going all the way down along the edge of South America. That's called the Humboldt current. It's very cold. You don't really want to even swim in the Pacific Ocean. Versus if you're on the coast of Florida, you're on the Gulf Stream current, which is very warm, right? That warm and cold streams, they flow in very predictable patterns called the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. And those patterns change when things like continents move, or when land bridges block those currents, like Central America. They force those currents to reroute. And what happens if you had a warm piece of land, but all of a sudden you have a cold current that gets rerouted against that warm land? It changes the climate. It can suck the water out, or it can add more water to it. You can go from a tropical forest to a desert in the matter of a few thousand years. So when Australia pulled away, it changed the global ocean currents, leading to the Southern Ocean, which is the ocean that surrounds Antarctica. Because those ocean currents are circumpolar. They just surround Antarctica. They're cold, and they just surround, and they surround, and they surround, and it builds a feedback effect to where it leads to the very first, at least since probably the Paleozoic, it leads to glacial ice developing as an ice cap. And the final point I want to leave you with is, imagine then that cold current, it now leads to ice on the poles, on the South Pole. That pole begins to grow more and more ice, and eventually it's going to take over all of Antarctica. And what do you think that effect is going to have on the rest of the world? A dramatic cool down effect. And that, my friends, is what will eventually lead, and this is the final point. Once we start glacial ice here, it's only a matter of like 10, 20 million years before we have glacial. Actually, it's a matter of about 45 to 47 million years before we get glacial ice on the North Pole. And when that happens, all of a sudden they start growing and building, and we hit this tipping point that we will enter called the Ice Age. Now, we're still 47 million years from the Ice Age, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But just imagine the precursors to the Ice Age start with Antarctica first. So I'm gonna leave you with this. What happens if the Antarctic ice shelf melts in our lifetime? Sea levels are gonna rise, right? But it will also trigger dramatic global, worldwide cascade effects. And this is just one example of how Antarctica is related to the entire Earth. And it's a good reminder as we leave today. We can't do anything about it probably, but it's a good reminder of that connectivity. If I can leave you with one silver lining, I just want you to reflect on the Permian extinction. Just have peace of mind knowing that when we're all gone, that this world will just keep on rocking. And in the future, tens of millions of years from now, after we screwed up the world, hey, it's okay. Earth's going to rebound. We might drive it into another mass extinction. It's okay. Earth will keep going. That's the silver lining I'm going to leave you with today. Okay, here we go. Hang on to your seats and let's get ready to discuss the tertiary period. Now, obviously I'm using tertiary in somewhat the old sense, right? That was the common term that people called the period of time between roughly, what's the beginning of the tertiary period? Now, remember, I wanted you guys, nowadays we divide the tertiary into two periods. What are those two periods?
Paleocene.
Paleogene. Good job, Matthew. So when, but it's helpful that you know what the tertiary is, right? Because so much of the literature refers to it as that. You know, if you read anything from the early 2000s back, they all call it the tertiary. So you need to make sure you know that. When did the tertiary begin? Yeah, about 65.5 million years ago, sometime around in there. And what's the end of the tertiary? No, it wouldn't be right now, because we're in a different period now. We're in the Quaternary period. So what's the end of the tertiary period? It's the beginning at the beginning of the Ice Age. So roughly 2.5, 2.6, 2.8, you know, the number, there's a new definition according to geologists, but I've seen different numbers. So just roughly 2.5 million years ago. So that's the tertiary. Now you could split that into two, which we do. Again, Paleogene and the Neogene. Paleogene roughly is the first part of that. So it's like 65.5 million years ago up until roughly, let's say 21 million years ago, somewhere in that time frame. That's the Paleogene. The Neogene would be 20 million years ago up until about 2.5 million years ago. So just want to continue to make sure we're reinforcing that. Again, if you don't know those epochs and periods and eras, you need to make sure you're really staying on top of that. All right, last class period, we primarily talked about the Mesozoic era. We went through the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous, and then we barely started entering into the Cenozoic. We talked about the extinction of dinosaurs and the KT boundary, for example. And then as we got into the Cenozoic, we started going through just a sort of a highlight of what were some of the more important factors that are present in the Cenozoic era. So as we get into, say, 65 million years, what are some key things over the course of time of the tertiary that we want to be thinking about? So let's look at some of those real quick. We hit some of these the other day. Briefly, plate tectonics, right? We talked about this. This is going to continue to be a major force from the beginning of the Paleogene period all the way through to early in the Neogene. So roughly from 65.5 million years ago to probably to about 20 million years ago. That's about the time at which plate tectonics really is a big force. When you get more recently than 20 million years ago, there's not a lot of tectonic stuff that's sort of really impactful in the world at that time. There's a little bit. We'll talk about that. The biggest things that we talk about when we talk about plate tectonics that will go on to influence the rest of time from 60 million years ago to the present are things like what's happening with India the fact that it's about to collide with Asia, the continued separation between South America and Africa. They get wider and wider apart. The Atlantic Ocean gets wider. You've got the complete separation of Australia from Antarctica, and then the separation of Antarctica from South America, forming a body of water called Drake's Passage, which was named for Sir Francis Drake. And then finally, and this is the most recent example of some tectonic activity, is the connection of Central America to Northern South America via the Isthmus of Panama about 3 to 3.5 million years ago. So those are the key events right there. They're all very, very important. Every single one of those that I just mentioned impacts North America in ways that we'll talk a little bit more about. Chase? Absolutely. Yeah. So Chase was making the point that we think about marsupials as largely connected today to Australia, but they actually originated in South America, began to spread, throughout parts of the world. And now they're just largely died out from those other continents. The Virginia opossum that moved up. Okay. And moved up from South America in recent times. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I've got a slide devoted to where Central America connects, and we'll definitely come back and touch on that in a bit. Some other key events then, in addition to plate tectonics, right? The movements of continents, separation of continental land masses. And we see this with like India. Take a look over here. India, when it was part of Pangaea, was down here on the north side of where Madagascar is, and it's sort of tucked up against the eastern coast of Africa. You had India formed the northwest border of Australia, and then those all broke away beginning around probably 75 to 60 million years ago. That breakaway began to happen. Over the course of, here we are, 50 million years, for example, India is now on a collision course north, drifting across the Indian Ocean on a collision course with South Asia. Remember, just like how Africa, we talked about, collided with North America, long before it gets there, it is sort of like a bulldozer, right? It's bulldozing up ocean floor deposits, and it's having a ripple effect long before it reaches. Notice that's what we're showing here. You see that the ripple there that's beginning to buckle up and form the Himalaya mountains. That'll continue. In fact, it's still continuing today. India is still being shoved into South Asia, meaning that the Himalayas are still in a process of very rapid uplift. So they're a very young mountain range. While that's going on, in North America, beginning around 60 million years ago, you have the rapid uplift of the Rocky Mountains. And it's not just one event. There's actually various pulses of uplift. So the Rockies have kind of like, they have risen quickly, and they kind of erode, and then they rise again. There's been various kind of pulses, and that's largely driven by the Pacific tectonic plate, which is underneath the Pacific Ocean, which is riding underneath the North American tectonic plate, lifting up the Rocky Mountains. Okay? That, by the way, that's a different orogeny than what we talked about here in the East. We had the Alleghanian orogeny and the Taconian orogeny, the Acadian. The one that's responsible for the uplift of the whole chain of the Rockies, we call that the Laramide orogeny, Laramide, the Laramide orogeny. So the uplift of the Rockies becomes very important for North America. And together, the Himalayas and the Rockies combined, what did we say that the combined effect of those massive mountain ranges had on the Earth? What was one, Juliet, do you remember? The rise of these mountain ranges. Change wind patterns, right? So, if you think about flying in an airplane at 30,000 feet, you're just barely over the height of Mount Everest at that point. So at that elevation, that massive uplift of mountains has the ability to change the jet stream. And so when you change the jet stream, if you think about like in the wintertime, remember back around, I guess, early January, we went in that deep freeze where we got all that snow, and we had that sort of polar vortex that came down. The jet stream plunges out of the Arctic down here, bringing that massively cold weather. Well, those are the kinds of processes that can bring us very, severe or rather drastic fluctuations in climate. It can mean the difference between having cold blasts on occasion or having a very cold climate period, right? The fact that much of Siberia, for example, is a lot colder on average than parts of Alaska or even parts of Canada has to do in part with the jet stream coming farther down, bringing that Arctic air even a little bit farther south. So the jet stream is very important. And not only do you have that sort of current, there's like, these air currents to deal with, but then as we'll talk about in a second, you have ocean currents as well. They also are helping to moderate the temperature and the climate of Earth. So those kinds of changes, as well as the jet stream, are very important. And ocean currents are, of course, affected by land masses, right? If you've got the Bering Land Bridge, for example, where Russia and Alaska come together, if that all of a sudden is connected landmass, then you can't have ocean currents flowing through that anymore. So those ocean currents have to get rerouted into different places. But what happens when sea levels rise and those land bridges are no longer blocking the way? Well, then ocean currents can reroute. Warm currents can be taken into areas where it's formerly cold. Cold currents can be taken into places where it's formerly warm. So sea level rise is a big deal because when sea levels drop, it exposes land bridges. When sea levels rise, it covers up land bridges. We've had a lot of those through the course of time, and over the past, say, 100 million years, there's been various land bridges that have opened and closed, particularly up in the Arctic. So not only is the Bering Land Bridge, it's thought to be the one that Native Americans crossed from Siberia into North America prior to probably 20 to 30,000 years ago. Well, certainly prior to 21,000 years ago, probably even earlier. But we also have had at points in time these other land bridge connections, which we've talked about over across the North Atlantic. Now, those land bridges, however, predate human evolution. There were no people alive on the planet when those land bridges were connected at points of time at like 60 million years ago or 40 million years ago. And they weren't always, Jacob, they were not always perfectly connected. These sometimes were disconnected. And so you would have expected some dispersal of species to have had to happen across bodies of water. But even though they were slightly disconnected, like an island chain, species were still able to use those as for stepping stones. So with rerouting, with mountains uplifting and creating things like rain shadows, with jet streams changing, with ocean currents changing, with sea level fluctuating, rising and falling, one of the things that this began to have an effect on was a cooling down of Earth's climate. So as we get into about, say, 70 to 60, maybe 50, 55 million years ago, we were very hot. It was much warmer here than at any time it has been in the past 100 million years. We would say that the Earth was undergoing greenhouse conditions, similar to what some climate projections forecast us to become in the future. It was very hot, for example, during the Paleocene and the Eocene. However, because of what's happening like in Antarctica, where we talked about polar ice begins to develop in the South Pole, and these mountains are building in the Northern Hemisphere, it's beginning to have a cooling effect on the entire planet. So that means we evolved for the first time ever in the history of the world, deciduous trees that are deciduous because of cold temperatures. Now, when we reviewed biomes the other day, I quickly ran through the fact that, in places like Costa Rica and Mexico, you can, and in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, you can have this, where, the trees will drop their leaves because of not enough rainfall, right? But in this case, these trees are beginning to drop their leaves because they're going through that dormancy period of fall and winter. That is an innovation. That's a new feature that happens for the first time in the early Paleogene period because of this global cool down. So what we might expect then is that tropical species that were common across North America at the time in these tropical and subtropical rainforests, as they're being subjected with major climatic change, what would you suggest might be happening here in North America? As you're going from tropical species that are confronted with a cool down climatically, what would be one thing you might expect to happen over, let's say, a few million years? Jaron, you got any ideas? Say again, what was that? Air? Oh, hair. Got you. Let's keep it restricted to let's restrict it to plants. Sorry, I didn't clarify, but yeah. So one you said is extinction, right? Many species that will not be able to adjust quickly enough will go extinct. If you don't go extinct, what might you also do if you want to stay alive? Matthew? Okay, so you mentioned a key word, evolution, right? Evolve. The existing species may begin to be subjected to the forces of natural selection and genetic drift and those things. We might be seeing evolution take place among certain groups, right? And then what's one other phenomenon you would expect, right? Let's just imagine it starts getting colder all of a sudden and you got tropical species. Kiki? Exactly, migration, right? Northern species might all of a sudden drift farther south. Even plants migrate, right, through seed dispersal and pollen exchange. So yeah, those three factors, extinction and migration and evolution, are all going on at this time. Especially with tropical species, they're evolving into deciduous relatives. So take the pawpaw tree, for example. That's a small tree we find in forests, very commonly right here around Clarksville. It's in a plant family called the Ananaceae. You don't necessarily need to know that. But almost all the Ananaceae are found in places like the Amazon rainforest or in Africa's tropical forests. The only representatives we really have here in North America are either around the Everglades or in South Florida, except for one species which is common all the way up to the Great Lakes region in moist forests. That particular species evolved from tropical relatives into a deciduous descendant. So they adapted and they evolved. The other ones, they would have migrated or they went extinct, or maybe they pulled down into Central America, or they maybe hopped over onto the Caribbean islands. All those were possibilities. Okay, so those are some key things: land bridges, continental drift, rise of mountains, ocean current changes, climatic changes, rising and falling of sea levels. Those are all the important drivers of the evolution of the North American continent, and some key drivers in the evolution of ecosystems and of species here in North America. Now what I'd like to do is let's begin to roll through and talk about each of the epochs, or I still don't know what the hell, how do you pronounce that word, guys? I say epoch or epoch, but you call them epochs. I think epochs, it makes more sense because if I say epoch, in my accent, it can come out as epic, E-P-I-C, and I'm not trying to say that. So I'm gonna say epoch, okay. All right, so as far as the epochs go, the first one of the Paleogene period, again, if this was 20 years ago, we'd say the Tertiary period, is the Paleocene. And what this basically means is paleo, meaning ancient, Eocene, this means like it's ancient or before the Eocene. That's one way you can kind of remember that. This is about a 10 million year span of time, from 65 to 55 million years ago. And just as a reminder, we're going to kick it off with the Paleocene. And then next, I want you to say them with me, with the ones that are coming after. Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene, Quaternary. Basically, the Pliocene, then Quaternary. The Quaternary includes two epochs, the Pleistocene and the Holocene. Okay. Now, take a look at this artist rendering here, and we can get sort of an idea of what life might have been like in the Paleocene. We have things like a number of small mammals. We have things like rodents. We certainly have even larger mammals than that. We have what is this thing right here. Is that like it's like a sugar glider type animal, right? There's crocodilians here. There's reptiles. There's definitely amphibians. There's a wide variety of turtles. Many of these are going to be very recognizable groups of species or genera that are quite similar to things that we still have today. There's also going to be a lot of genera that are now extinct that we do not have today. But what's missing? Most of your modern mammals, things like, camels and horses and hippopotamus and rhinos or dogs and cats, these things are far from evolving. They have not even been thought about yet. Their lineages are here. Their ancestors are here, but they still have a few, either a few million or a few tens of million years to go to evolve. Certainly not everything is swampy. I don't mean to give that impression, but a lot of our Paleocene fossils are from sites that were swampy because that's the only place that really fossilized that well. What would you say about the climate of the Paleocene? Let's just say this is Tennessee, and I think this is probably an accurate representation based on what we know from what has been found. What would the climate have been during the Paleocene here? What would you say, Ryan? Subtropical? That's a good guess. Yeah, it probably was tropical to subtropical during the Paleocene.
I got a question.
It was definitely shifting. Yeah, Laura?
Yeah, I'm sorry. When you say the abundance of the fossils in the Paleocene, but it would seem to me there'd be a really high decomposition rate there with all that going on.
Oh, yeah, very much. Yeah. Well, what I mean to say is that the only place you're going to expect fossilization is going to be along river floodplains and swamps. You might get a leaf that's immediately covered up, let's say by silt from a flooding river, right?
Oh, okay.
That can fossilize. But if you have just a leaf that's blowing around in an upland, you're never going to expect those to fossilize.
I got you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, Ryan, yeah, this was a subtropical or tropical. We probably were a little bit more on the tropical end, and that's what this image conveys, right? There are things like palm trees, and there's water lotus, aquatic plants. There's a variety of ferns and other kinds of spore-bearing plants as well. Lots of insect diversity. A lot of birds, of course, during this time are evolving still and radiating. And in Tennessee, we do have some Paleocene fossil sites, a few in West Tennessee and one way up in Northeast Tennessee that I'll talk about later. You'll see a few of these maps in this portion of the presentation. And so what I have here are some one-letter codes that basically signify what we know about climate, judging from the remains of plants and animals. And there are some other lines of evidence. We can reconstruct carbon dioxide, for example, concentrations. And that's a good way to understand what temperature was, because remember I showed you last class how carbon dioxide very closely approximates global temperature. So there's a number of types of data we can use to extrapolate whether this was a tropical or a subtropical area. So the T here stands for tropical. The P stands for paratropical, which is sort of like subtropical. And the D stands for deciduous. So in this case, we can see that the more northerly latitudes, like up in southern Canada, around where Alberta, Canada is, for example, that's already beginning to cool down, right? But if you were to go back to the Cretaceous and look at climate projections then, parts of Alaska had palm trees in the Cretaceous. There were crocodilians in Alaska during the Cretaceous about 70 million years ago. So let's look at some key North American continental sort of landscape features during this time. Number one, let me ask you, how does the Paleocene continent of North America differ from Cretaceous North America? What's one big change? I want you to think back to like Kansas from like 80 million years ago. What kind of fossils would you expect to be found in Kansas from 80 million year old late Cretaceous rock? Would you expect What would you expect? Yeah, marine animals, right? Like plesiosaurs, you know, the Loch Ness monster types, right? So we had the intercontinental seaway. Remember that? The Central North American Seaway. We don't have that anymore, and I'll explain why. One is that the Rocky Mountains are being uplifted to the west. So as the Rockies lift up, that's creating an uplift effect over what is now the Central Great Plains region. You ever heard of the high plains, right? The high plains is a term for like western Kansas, western Nebraska, western South Dakota, parts of eastern Wyoming, North Texas. Denver, Colorado, great example of the high plains. Got any football fans here? What do they call the football stadium in Denver? Mile High Stadium, right? It's not in the Rocky Mountains. It's on the plains east of the Colorado Rockies at an elevation approximately 1 mile above sea level, right? A little over 5,000 feet. So while it's not in the mountains, it's on the high plains. It's still high elevated. If you were to go to West Kansas, the elevations in western Kansas are like 2,000 or 3,000 feet higher than we are right here in Clarksville, Tennessee. They're at like 4,000 feet. And so that's because that whole western edge of the Great Plains was uplifted as the Pacific tectonic plate was moving underneath. You see this dark line? Tell me what it is again. It's a deep sea trench right off the coast of California. That Pacific plate and the North American plate are colliding, and that's helping to uplift this mountain range here, and that's also pulling this up. Well, as those ranges of mountains lifts, what's happening to that central interior seaway? It's protracting, or it's retracting to the north and south, right? So the northern portion of it begins to drain into the Arctic. The southern portion begins to drain into the Gulf of Mexico. Eventually, the whole thing uplifts to where that entire seaway disappears entirely. Now, a word for a shallow sea that covers a large section of a continent is called an epicontinental sea. You can see the word right there on that second to last bullet point. You need to make sure you know what an epicontinental sea is. That prefix epi just means upon, basically. So it's a shallow sea upon a continent. Now, when that sea was there, and again, you can go back and look at the previous lectures to make sure you have that in your mind. But when that sea was there, the weight of that water was really substantial, right? Think about the volume of water over that sea. That was a massive amount of additional weight. So when you don't have that water anymore, the water drains off and it becomes land. That's a huge amount of weight that is all of a sudden alleviated. So there's two things happening. Not only is the western portion of North America being uplifted by the tectonic activity, as I mentioned, of the Pacific plate and the North American plate colliding, but the fact that you no longer have the weight of that sea means that the land can rebound. So what do I mean by that? Remember how we talked about continental crust is basically floating? What's it floating in? What's it floating on top of? It's floating on top of the asthenosphere, the upper levels of the mantle, which is molten metal, right? It's more dense than the land is above it. So if you have land that is covered with an ocean, that's still lighter, technically less dense than the asthenosphere of the mantle is below it. So as that water runs off, that land now has less weight, and it's still less dense than the mantle below it. So the mantle below it then begins to push up on it. And that process of sort of rebounding, the land rebounding or sort of lifting up once a weight like ice or water is pulled off of it, it's a very important term. We're going to come back and talk about it again and again. And you can see it right here on this last point. It's called isostatic rebound. Isostatic rebound. So that also was important. So what happens then when you have the land rising again, is that if you have uplift, which is what the land rising creates, then immediately then you would also expect what in opposition to uplift? If uplift is happening, what are you expecting from a counteracting process? Specifically, I'm looking, if you got uplift, what's the opposite of uplift? Erosion, down cutting, right? So streams are beginning to cut down in that new land surface that is being exposed. As that exposed land no longer has a sea on it and it's rising, rivers and streams now that are flowing across that land are able to cut down into it more deeply. What is that doing to the area of Central North America? Sculpting it, right? Creating river valleys and canyons and gorges and all these kinds of features. So what we're seeing then is this isostatic rebound and lots of erosion that's taking place. Where will all that erosion go? Where will all those soils go that's being carried away from the newly uplifted Great Plains and from the Rocky Mountains that are even higher to their west? Where does that stuff go? Yeah, a lot of it will go to the southeast, right? Think about where modern day rivers like the Arkansas River or the Red River or the Missouri River, they flow out of the Rockies and carry their waters into the Gulf of Mexico. That's been happening for tens of millions of years. Two big things on erosion. Number one, where did the productive fertile soils of the Great Plains come from in the first place? Because remember, if that was all under ocean and it was formed limestone, for example, as it was lifted up, where did all those rich agricultural soils come from? James, what do you think? Where do those deep, fertile soils of the Great Plains come from? Something to do with what now? Nitrogen? Even before nitrogen. I mean, yeah, nitrogen is part of the process, sure, but like, where did the soil itself, like, where did they originate? Yeah, from the Rocky Mountains. So as the Rockies are rising quickly, these big jagged peaks, they're being knocked down by erosion, and those sediments are being carried by rivers out across this newly exposed, uplifted land that was once a sea, forming the Great Plains, right? And then the soils that are now being carried away by these incising rivers that are beginning to cut the Great Plains up are also being carried away, and collectively all those sediments, all that sand, all that gravel, and all those other kinds of materials ultimately will be carried down through rivers, forming what off the coast of modern day Texas? They're going to add to the coastal plain. They're going to become part of the sediments that will fill in the shallow ocean on the continental shelf. Gradually, that'll form a coastal plain, right? Remember, that whole coastal plain is younger than 65 million years. The coastal plain is being built through the Paleocene, the Eocene, and through the Miocene and Pliocene, et cetera. So a lot of this coastline, see how where the modern borders of Louisiana and Texas are, right? All that has to be built as land, and that comes from sediments being washed both from the Rockies, from the Central Great Plains region, which doesn't exist right now. That Central Great Plains right now is tropical and subtropical rainforest. And then it's coming off the Appalachians. That's what's building South Alabama, coastal Texas, and Louisiana. Okay. All right. All right, let's go next. Let's talk about what are some of the major animal groups of the Paleocene. We've got things like sharks, skates, rays, a variety of types of marine organisms. Again, these are primarily things that are coming from southeastern fossil sites that are from the Paleocene. You know, parts of Alabama, Mississippi, West Tennessee. You got certain types of crocodilian relatives, turtles of various kinds, lots of different kinds of mammals, particularly the perissodactyl mammals. These are the odd-toed ungulates, okay, as opposed to, say, even-toed ungulates, things like Give me an example of something with odd toes. A horse, that'd be an odd toed ungulate. They have one toe today, right? But horse ancestors used to have 3 or 5. Versus something with paired toes like a cloven hoofed animal like a pig, which has just 2 toes. So the perissodactyls or the odd toed ungulates were diversifying during this time. The faunal record indicates that many of the animals that lived at this time had mostly widely distributed in tropical to warm temperate climates with a lot of affinities with both Europe and Asia. And why would that make sense that we would have strong animal affinities with Europe and Asia for North America? South America still has not connected. So from 60 million years ago, we got to wait 57 million years before they'll have a chance to connect. That later connection is what eventually will bring opossums to North America and armadillos, right? So how do those connect? They connect via land bridges over the North Atlantic or through Siberia, which at this time is not Arctic at all, right? It's very tropical or subtropical or deciduous, even at those high latitudes near the Arctic Circle. That means that plants and animals can fairly move freely through somewhat continuous forested conditions and migrate throughout the Northern Hemisphere in relatively consistent conditions. Okay, next up, we're going to go to the next epoch, the Eocene. This is a longer period. This is almost 20 million years. This spans from 55 to 34 million years. And during the Eocene, this is a time of the hottest conditions on Earth, really for probably the past 70 million years. We literally get to a very warm greenhouse condition. The animals of the Eocene are enormous. The biggest land mammals that existed, species like Uintatherium, for example, this huge thing that looks sort of like a rhinoceros, even though they're not really related. These things right here in the upper left, what do y'all think those little things are? Those little small animals are about 2 feet tall. They're in the upper left. Ancestors of tapirs? They could be. I think they're not, though. Tapirs are a great guess, by the way. They're horses. Yeah, those little dog-like animals are the early horses. And at this time, they would have had multiple toes, odd toes. They're perissodactyl mammals. And eventually, they'll grow and get larger and faster, and they'll lose toes. They'll become a one-toed horse. And then in the bottom scene, you can actually see there's some more horse relatives there in the lower right. We also have at this time various types of primates that live both in Europe and in North America. So we would have had primates here as well. Now, generally speaking, for the Paleocene and the Eocene, for most of the Eocene, grasses either have not evolved very early in the tertiary period, or they're just beginning to evolve. Now that number is beginning to push back, and I don't know what the latest science is. I suspect grasses are present as long ago as the late Cretaceous before the dinosaurs go extinct, but they are not dominant yet. That's the key point. They exist, but they're not dominant. And we do not have grasslands, for example, in the Eocene. That ain't even a thing to be thought about. Now, that's not to say we don't have savannas. We have open ecosystems like the scene in the top, but they tend not to be grass dominated. Jared?
The earliest grasses potentially found are actually from 100 million years ago. So
That's good. Late Cretaceous. Yeah. Awesome. So, Matthew, you had a question.
the primates in South America, will they not get there until North America survives South America? I heard they were there before that happened.
That's a good question. So, primates in South America are primarily New World monkeys, right? And as opposed to Old World monkeys. We had monkeys in North America. I'm not super familiar with primate phylogeny. So I can't remember if they would have, I assume they probably would have gotten there through North America, because by the time primates evolved, so I know there's a lot of moving parts here, right? It's like 10 games of chess at once. South America and Africa became separated completely 100 million years ago. So they were so far removed that there would be no possibility for interchange between Africa and South America after 100 million years. Therefore, a lot of the animals would have had to have come either through Antarctica, like the marsupials did, or they would have come down from North America in more recent times. You'll have to read up on that and let me know what you find out. Yeah. Okay. Maybe Jared, maybe if you can look into that, see. When did primates get to South America? Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. So we're looking at this time period, 55 to 34 million years ago is the Eocene. Okay. Now, from a climate perspective, notice that the Southeast has begun to get increasingly cooler, as evidence that we don't have T's anymore, indicating tropical conditions. We have S's for subtropical. There is some tropical vegetation, certainly in Mexico. A lot of Mexico would have been tropical, even though I don't have that labeled. The Cuba and the islands in the Caribbean would have been as well. But also notice you have tropical vegetation out there as far north as coastal Oregon and coastal California. Jared, what do you got?
All right, about 34 million years ago.
Okay.
Apparently they rafted from Africa to South America.
There we go, man. Here I was just totally missing it. They rafted over the ocean. How about
Yeah,
that?
it's on like whatever, like Watson the Jet, some of the big enough support of.
Okay.
It was mostly smaller species, like insectivorous stuff.
Yeah, I'll just tell the groups here online. So the question from Matthew was, when did primates get to South America? Which is a good question. They rafted over, in case you didn't hear that, they rafted over from Africa to South America, probably on some floating log.
A barrel. They came in a barrel.
Came in a barrel of monkeys.
Yeah.
See, that Laura would be great at that. About 34 million years ago, they came over. All right. Incidentally, cotton was a plant that is native to Africa. It jumped also across the Atlantic via long distance seed dispersal sometime in the past few million years. So that's an example of at least a plant example that also was able to make that jump into South America. Let me finish up with this one slide that we're going to take a break. So what are some key landscape features for North America during the Eocene? A lot of volcanism. So there's lots of volcanic activity, a lot of lava that's being spewed in the West Coast, in the Rocky Mountains. Again, this is part of the Laramide orogeny. Okay. These Rocky Mountains that are uplifting effectively sort of begin to split North America, not like with a hard split in terms of like a physical, like an ocean, but they really segregate North America into a western mountainous region and the Great Plains and areas farther east. So kind of for the first time, at least during the Eocene, really presents this sort of western Rocky region, Rocky Mountain region, and sort of an eastern region. And as part of that, during this time, you do have fairly tropical to subtropical conditions across. There are still forests that are basically going from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. It's very wet, it's very humid during the Eocene. Again, it's very hot. And the Rockies are not high enough yet to form a rain shadow. Okay. That's not happened quite yet, but it's coming. And so when that rain shadow forms, that large forest that would have spread from East Coast to West Coast, eventually that forest is going to become fragmented right down the middle of the country because of the rain shadow that develops on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains. That makes sense because the rains coming in off the Caribbean and things like the storms, the hurricanes, right, that hit coastal Texas. Well, those rains don't really get any further inland than about right here. Right? Today's tornado zone, for example, Tornado Alley is right through here. So they can't penetrate up into this region. The rains from Southern California, likewise, they carry about to here. As long as it's flat, those rains can carry far into the interior. But with the mountain range rising rapidly, it's going to prevent a barrier that prevents rainfall coming from the southwest, and it's going to prevent a barrier that rainfall simply can't go too far inland from the southeast. And we get that rain barrier, that rain shadow, that big gigantic forest that spread from coast to coast is going to become naturally fragmented. Eventually, we're not there yet. This comes in the next period, the Oligocene. That's when we begin to see the worldwide rise in grasslands, okay? The mountains have reached about half of their present elevation. So if many of the Rockies today are like 10 to 16,000 feet elevation, this means they were probably about the height of today's Great Smoky Mountains, more or less, 6,000, 7,000 feet, 5,000 feet. But the Smokies don't really present, the Southern Blue Ridge doesn't really present a barrier to rainfall. Now, you still have land bridge connections. So it's still warm enough, but notice, what is it like up in Alaska? Fully deciduous conditions. So the ability for tropical species to move in and out of Asia or in and out of Europe is over. And it will be over permanently. The far northern latitudes will never again have tropical species. Soon, and now the Eocene, they still do. Yes, there are still palm trees up there. But towards the end of the Eocene, remember it's a 20 million year long epoch. With the end of the Eocene, it becomes fully deciduous. It goes from tropical at the beginning of the Eocene to fully deciduous by the end. That means, that spells disaster for tropical species in places like coastal Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and farther north up into Alaska, okay? Now, deciduous species will still be able to move freely across the Bering Land Bridge, like maple trees, hickory trees, oak trees, maybe. Yeah, sure, oaks. Redwood trees. A lot of these things are deciduous. They can move. And then certainly animals that live in deciduous forest as well. Let's close on this point. One I can think of that we'll come back and talk about in a little bit would be some like horses, for example. You know, the various horse groups would be free to roam across, even though they're not grassland species yet. All right, and then finally, you do have major basins beginning to open up, particularly in the west. Out here in these newly emerging Rocky Mountains, you have a lot of lakes and swamps, and those are going to be really important because some of our best fossil sites in North America from which we can know all this come from places like Wyoming and Idaho and Oregon. And that we'll touch on a little bit. Let's take all right, gang, here we go. Picking it up with the Eocene then. We're talking about the sort of Eocene climate. Here's a map showing the sort of the outline of at least the lower part of North America during the Eocene period. And largely, I hope you can see, we're really getting close to the existing North American continent that we're familiar with, right? Just to repeat myself, when you go back to Cretaceous, we were getting there, but we had that big intercontinental seaway. We also had a huge portion of the Mississippi embayment and the coastal plain was still underwater during the Cretaceous, right? Remember, we can actually draw a line roughly right through here. All that was that was all underwater from there south. So what's beginning to happen with the Paleocene and the Eocene is, at least with respect to the southeastern coastline, the ocean levels are successively receding, right, to the south and southeast. So that we're going to begin, and now they're not only are the ocean levels going to recede at times, meaning to drop, because that's not all there is, because it is a very hot place. Actually, ocean levels are at the highest they've ever been in the past probably 80 million years. Oh, well, not past 80 million. They're very high because of the very warm conditions. But part of what is also happening is the erosion from the Rockies and the Appalachians is building that continental shelf, right? It's filling in those coastal wetlands in those floodplains. So those are important to remember. So notice how fractured and fragmented that southern coastline is. And that's because there are river deltas coming in. See all those barrier islands, for example, in Texas? That's happening because you got rivers that are carrying heavily laden with silt that are entering into the Gulf of Mexico. And those are dropping sediments, creating small islands, and that's creating barrier islands. So you got this whole complicated coastline, largely in part because you got river corridors. They're coming off, dropping those sort of, deltaic plains of Texas, for example. Let's take a little bit of a magnified view of the coastal plain over Alabama and Mississippi. So this is a map that shows where the Eocene coastline was about 38 million years ago. And just for some context here, here's the Florida state line. I'm trying to find out. Yeah, it would be right here, more or less. Yeah, that's the Florida line. Here's the city of Montgomery, where the star is. There's the city of Birmingham, where the other star is. Now, where on this map, and I realize geography is not everybody's strong suit. If you had to say where the very oldest rocks of this region are, where would you pinpoint the oldest rocks? Ken? It would not be that. And I'll tell you why. It wouldn't be that because those are the remains of the previous periods and epochs that have been washed off, right? So they've been covered up. But like in terms of going back to rocks where, let's say from the Grenville orogeny, for example, there's somewhere on this map you would expect to find those really ancient Precambrian rocks. Chase? Yeah, particularly just to the south and east. Why? Because that is what region? What is that ecoregion? East of the Blue Ridge is what? It's the Piedmont. Yeah, and the westernmost edge of the Piedmont comes into eastern Alabama, about where Auburn, Alabama is, just to the sort of east, northeast of Montgomery. That's where that Pine Mountain window is with those Grenville aged rocks. Okay. In fact, Pine Mountain is probably this range of mountains, like either right here or right there. Where's the second oldest sort of patch of rocks? If the Piedmont has the oldest, the Precambrian age, then the second oldest would be where? Relative to the stuff down on the coast, it'd be up there in the Appalachians or in the areas just to the west of the Appalachians. So let's take a look at that. Precambrian rock, oldest. Paleozoic rocks, right? Remember all those rocks we've already gone past? The Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian. Although we said once you get to the Permian, Jurassic, and Triassic, I said those out of order. Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, and early Cretaceous, they don't exist up there. They've all been carried down into the ocean, into the coastline. But now what I want to do is let's take a look at where that Cretaceous coastline was at the time the dinosaurs went extinct. It was right in that area, maybe even a little bit farther north. Notice that this coincides with the distribution of the fall line hills. Remember that ecoregion? That's the edge of the fall line, okay? So that's the coastline as of 65 million years ago. Then here's the Paleocene. These strata would have been laid down from 65 to about 55 million years. That's where the coastline would have been. But we're talking about now the current Eocene. So some parts of this were in the ocean, some parts of this were on land, right? All in the same geologic epoch. And now let's carry this on out. We've got Miocene. So basically, as we project ahead, that sea level is going to continue to drop. We're going to see Miocene, Pliocene, and finally all the way up to the Ice Age with the Quaternary. And you see how we're building out the coastline of North America? Okay, let's talk about Eocene climate. Ocean temperatures reached a maximum for the entire Cenozoic era during the Eocene, particularly in the early Eocene. So at about 56 million years ago, in benthic waters, you had between 11 and 15 degrees warmer than at present. I believe these are in Celsius, by the way. At surface waters in the high latitudes, so the North Atlantic, the North Pacific Ocean, for example, temperatures were 21 degrees warmer than at present. So imagine how much that would have carried water, the warmth of the water would have carried that warmth onto land, right? And would have kept the air temperatures warm. There is no evidence for glaciers at all during the late Cretaceous period and through the Paleocene. There's a transition period of what we call early Eocene hothouse conditions. So again, it's very much like a greenhouse type environment. But and there was a transition period from to what we call late Cenozoic, so getting into the end, like Miocene, Oligocene, and Pliocene, we go into what's called icehouse conditions. So the early part, we were in hothouse. We begin to go into icehouse. Now that didn't mean it was cold and icy everywhere, but it means that we were beginning to develop Arctic ice toward the end of this period. And we have transitions in climate. We're probably quite rapid. Both cool down periods and warming periods were probably very rapid. And these pulses of climate were associated with major episodes of evolution, both in plants and animals. Let's talk a little bit about Eocene fauna. We do have primates. We've got just all kinds of things, fish, I mean, all the things you could possibly imagine, plus a lot more. The early Eocene fauna was a time of greatest similarity between North American and European faunas. So we had a lot of similarities between the two continents. There is still no interchange with South America, as you would expect. Ellesmere Island, Canada, there were alligator fossils way up there, almost in Greenland. We had arboreal primates. We had extinct relatives of lemurs. We had large salamanders, cousins of things like hellbenders. Various types of lizards, boa snakes, boa constrictor types, turtles and tortoises. Here's again, some things lived in marine conditions, some things that were terrestrial, particularly in Alabama, where during the same period you had both conditions. This is in the Conecuh River of South Alabama. And again, people here hunting for shark teeth from Eocene sharks. Here's a tip of a crocodile tooth in the Eocene Tallahassee Formation of Alabama, a little creek called Pigeon Creek in South. This is way down on the Florida border. This is in Conecuh County. Here's the fossil tooth of a rhinoceros type animal. Probably wasn't a true rhinoceros, but very similar. All right, we'll switch it out now and talk a little bit about vegetation during the Eocene. So here, especially during the latter part of the Eocene, things transition more to subtropical, and eventually they become going in the direction of deciduous. It's at this time we could really start pointing to groups of trees that we still have today. If you go back in the Paleocene and the Cretaceous, the trees that we had were very tropical. Remember I said they're like related to Malaysia and India and parts of Southeast Asia, right? But now we can start looking. And I realize you guys may not know the scientific names of some of these, but I'm going to just call out some general names of these plants. So let's look at first what's happening immediately right here in the southeastern U.S. region. Down on the coast of South Alabama and Florida, we have things like mangrove swamps. All right, we talked about those in our classification of biomes the other day. Right on the coastal edge, exactly where you would expect them. Warm subtropical waters, we have mangroves. If you come in places like Florida and South Alabama, we have a lot of pine, which today is a big pine-dominated region, longleaf pine savanna ecosystem. It's a fire-dominated landscape. And we have both Sabal and Serenoa, which are both, if you've ever been to Florida, anybody, been to Panama City or something, you drive out, you see all those pines, and then right on the ground level, you see a bunch of palms. Oftentimes they're like 3, 4, 5, 6 feet tall. Those are called palmettos. They had already evolved by 50 million years ago. So that pine palmetto ecosystem had already been established by 40, 50 million years ago. Why does that matter? Well, because a lot of people might make the claim that, that those ecosystems should maybe don't depend on natural fire, that those ecosystems are totally dependent on anthropogenic fire or human-caused fires. But that's really not true, because we have a record of fire. Fire record in North America goes back 400 million years to the Silurian. But that's just fire on the landscape that we have evidence of, right? As evidence from charcoal and those kinds of things in various types of strata. But fire that is probably like, and of course, fire can only start a couple, like 3 or 4 ways, right? You can human set fires, you got lightning, you may have lava that can set fire. I don't know of a fourth one. Can you guys think of one? It's pretty much the ones, right? Well, we don't have any volcanic activity down here. So you can strike out molten magma as an ignition source. Humans have not evolved, right? Nowhere on the planet do humans or their immediate ancestors that were capable of making fire, they don't exist at 55 million years ago. Primates at this point are very small and lemur-like, or like tarsiers, for example. We haven't even gotten to the stage of apes and the monkey groups yet. We're starting to get monkeys, yes. But what this indicates, though, is that the pine sort of savanna and palmetto savanna ecosystem that's so characteristic of a place like Florida was completely in place 40 to 50 million years ago. And the only explanation is that it was totally driven by lightning-dependent fire frequency. Now, we'll come back and touch on that later, because that is often used as a talking point when it's important that you know the fossil record, because the fossil record can testify in ways that other forms of evidence cannot. And so this strong record right here, along with charcoal deposits and that are in these fossilized soil remains and different geologic layers, testifies to the long legacy of fire is important on the southern landscape. Now, just a little bit north of there, when you get up into probably the area around where the Appalachians are, we have what's called Juglandaceae and Fagaceae. These are the plant names of plant families. The Juglandaceae is the walnut family, like walnut trees and hickory trees. Fagaceae are the oak family and the chestnuts and beech trees. They were very well established in this region, much as they are still today, right? We have oak trees and beech trees and all those things. When you go even farther north, look up there around like Pennsylvania and Ohio, we have Picea and Tsuga. Picea are spruce trees, Tsuga are hemlock trees. So we're starting to see coniferous trees that are more cold adapted to the north. When you get way up in the north, up in Canada, we have maples, hickories, corylus is hazelnut. We have carpinus, the hornbeams. Castanea is chestnut. Fagus is beech. We have larix, which is larch. Picea, spruce. Tsuga is hemlock, and betula is birch. So we're starting to get that northern sort of temperate deciduous forest that now is characteristic of much of Russia, Scandinavia, Europe, and northern parts of North America. If we look out finally to the West Coast, we could see other parallels. Many of the same groups of plants are also on the West Coast. So the implication then is that vegetation was probably widespread throughout the whole region, from East Coast to West Coast. Now, we don't have a lot of fossil sites right in the heart of the middle of the country, so we have to sort of extrapolate. Now, here's some of how we know this to be true. We have an extensive record of leaf fossils and other types of plant parts from the Eocene. And this is just sort of a fuzzy, I apologize for the granularity of this image. This is just a collection of Eocene fossil leaves from the West Coast. There's also some cones in here, some seeds. But there's a lot of stuff here that if you know your modern plants, you could pick out some stuff. Take a look, for example, right here. Anybody happen to know what that leaf represents? I'm gonna circle it on the, anybody know what this is? Not a tulip poplar. It's a sassafras. Yeah, looks exactly like a modern day sassafras. I'll show you a few of the other examples here. So we have an abundance of different kind of fossils. This is a fossil of a tree trunk from South Alabama. These are the locations of fossil florists. So again, these are where people have done studies, PhD dissertations, or master's thesis research. Notice how few we have in the east. We have none in the Great Plains. Many of them are on the West Coast. And that's because we had all those lakes and swamps. Before the Rockies uplifted, or sort of in between the mountain ranges, places like Oregon, California, Wyoming, they had an abundance of some of the best fossil records in the country. If you want to be a paleobotanist and study North American plants, there's a lot to do out there, right? And here, the closest for us is out in West Tennessee, Western Kentucky, in some of those clay mines. And I showed you a specimen of that. And by the way, here's another image. Remember, I passed those out kind of on first day of class. It's 50-million-year-old leaf impression in a piece of clay stone from West Tennessee. That particular deposit, you can see, extends all the way down into Alabama and through Mississippi up into Tennessee, a little bit of Kentucky. So that's the exact band you would have to go to find the right kinds of rocks to find Eocene leaves and Eocene animals if you want to find them. Now, there's been some study of the southeastern plants. I'm not going to go through a lot of this because if you're not a botanist, then some of this may or may not resonate. One thing I need to do here is I need to go into these tables and add the common names so that, you know, they're at least digestible to people who don't know the scientific names. But the reason I include this, obviously for your ability to go back and read further in your own time, but notice the differences of habitats that are already visible here in the Southeast. Mangrove swamps, sand scrub habitats like you see in Florida, paratropical to warm temperate forest, cool temperate forest, and floodplain freshwater swamps. If you look at these, all of those, especially that you see that have a red font, are very similar to what we see in parts of northeast Mexico today. A lot of these names, again, are sort of similar to what we see. It's just a list of plants. We don't have to go through all these. I'll show you a few of these, like Platanus wyomingensis is the Wyoming sycamore. I mean, anybody who's a botanist can look at that leaf and be like, hey, that's a sycamore leaf. Here's an invasive species that we have, Ailanthus, the tree of heaven. This is a living seed in the lower right. That's a fossil Ailanthus in the upper right from Idaho. This species does not, this whole genus, in fact, does not even grow naturally. It's not native to North America. It became extinct here at the end of the Eocene, became a totally Asian species, and then we reintroduced it as an invasive in its modern form to North America. Here's fossil leaves of sequoia. So we had redwoods, for example, in parts of here in the East and in the Pacific Northwest. Let me make a correction. I don't think we actually had redwoods here in the East. We have older cousins of the redwood here in the East called dawn redwood, but true redwood pretty much are only on the West Coast. We have leaves of ginkgo, for example, from British Columbia, Canada. There's the nuts of a hazelnut. We have a palm leaf that looks just like a cabbage palm from Northwest Florida. These are all from the Pacific Northwest, by the way. Sassafras, basswood leaves, fir trees. All right, and with that, the point being is that by the time we get to the end of the Eocene, a lot of those trees you probably heard people mention before, right? You probably heard sassafras and hickory. That's because we still have them around. But prior to the Eocene, we had very little overlap with our modern flora. So one of the big things, it's a huge milestone. When we reach the mid to late Eocene, we actually have a lot of the plants that are still common here today have evolved or arrived here through migration. That's a key point. Now, the world's about to get cooler. As it started to cool down in the Eocene, now we're hitting the Oligocene epoch, 34 to 24 million years. So it's about a 10 million year span of time. Animals are big. There's a lot of big carnivores during these times. Many of the ancestors to saber-toothed cats are around. Horses keep diversifying and getting larger. We've got things like hyena relatives here in North America and in Europe. We've got hippopotamus and rhinoceros ancestors in this region. We have tapirs, these weird animals that kind of have like a pig-like snout. We've got camels and all kinds of cool species like that that are beginning to evolve at this period. Now, the world's getting cooler and it's getting drier. And cool and dry both combined mean that tropical rainforests are beginning to decline. They're beginning to fragment. And a lot of that is happening because of that, the rain shadow we talked about forming on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. Another big thing is happening though. With worldwide cooling and drying, we're getting more things like fire, and the plants that are best adapted, right, have the naturally have a higher fitness for cooler, drier, and more fire-adapted ecosystems. And a lot of grazers are what? What group of plants? The grasses. Yeah, the grasses begin their major radiation across the world. This is when we see the rise of grasslands, is during the Oligocene. Now, they don't reach their worldwide maximum distribution until the next epoch, the Miocene. The Miocene is the time of greatest worldwide grassland expansion. Now, during the Oligocene, from a continental perspective, we have a few things that are beginning to happen. Number one, the rate of erosion of the Appalachian Mountains exceeds uplift. What does that mean? That means there's not a lot of push-up happening under the Appalachian Mountains anymore. An important term here is called quiescence. Quiescence. The Appalachians, beginning in the Eocene through the Oligocene, are undergoing a long period of geologic quiescence, which means things are quiet. They're not actively being uplifted very much. Let me ask you, why does that make sense? Why does it make sense that the Appalachians are not being uplifted anymore? Say again, Ryan? Yeah, Africa is moving farther away, right? The Atlantic Ocean is widening, right? They're not on the edge of an active continental plate boundary, right? They're on the far end of a plate boundary. So there's no active orogenic forces or mountain building forces that are pushing continents together to lift up Eastern North America anymore. That's one big thing. Now, I'm going to hold off on the second part of that explanation, because when we get to the Miocene, 20 million years ago, we see a reversal of that. But it's not what you might expect. We're not going to see Africa bumping back into North America anytime soon. But something is going to cause the Appalachians to start rising again. And that's going to be a major element to the story that we'll pick back up on. Now, one of the things that begins to happen around 34 to 24 million years ago during the Oligocene is that sea level, the coastlines continue to migrate southward. We're building that coastal plain. And then notice how the western coast of America is beginning to take shape, right? Now, we still don't have the whole western fringe of California, Oregon, and Puget Sound, Washington are not there yet. They're still in the ocean. It has to be built up. That coastal edge of California and Oregon is called the coastal mountains. They're not going to be built yet. That's going to become an important part of the extinction of a lot of species in the West Coast. For now, though, we are beginning to see the rise of a second major range of mountains in California called the Sierra Nevada Mountains, right? Those are the ones that are on the border between California and Nevada, and they come right up into southernmost Oregon. what do you think the effect is of having, let's say, the Rockies here? Let's draw this out a little bit. Here's the West Coast. Here's the East Coast. We got the Rockies as this big, extensive mountain range, right? And we've got some various, we said, basins and lakes out here with a lot of forest around. But now what we're saying is we're building up another mountain range called the Sierra Nevadas right there. What do you think the impact of having another mountain range a few hundred miles west of the Rockies is going to have on the West Coast? It's going to cut down on the amount of rain coming off the Pacific Ocean even more, right? So whatever those Rockies, remember they were lifting rapidly? Well, now coming on the back end of that uplift of the Rockies is the rapid rise of the Sierra Nevadas. Now you have not one mountain range restricting the rainfall, movement of rainfall. You have two mountain ranges. So as these rise, not only do you have a rain shadow developing here in the central part of the continent, right? You also have a rain shadow now developing here. And that's going to eventually form and lead to what we call the Great Basin deserts. So all those forests that were common, like sassafras and sycamore trees and redwood trees and maple trees, tulip poplar trees that were common in the West like they are today in like Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia, they're going to disappear because the West is about to undergo a massive drying episode. It's going to lead to a lot of extinction of Western tree species. Okay. Any questions about that? All right, let's talk real quick about Oligocene climate. So drying begins in the mid-Eocene, expands into the Oligocene. As the temperature also declines, so it's getting cooler and drier. There's a few details here which we can get into a little bit here. Let's review some of these. Carbon dioxide declines with decrease in tectonic activity because uplift affects climate by creating rain shadows, altering atmospheric circulation patterns, increasing the erosion of silicate rocks that causes the drawdown of carbon dioxide, allows heat to escape the troposphere and results in lower temperatures. I'm not going to attempt, I mean, I would probably need 30 minutes to work through that myself. But the point of that is, look at the interplay of all that stuff, right? Ocean, you've got the certain rock types are able to draw down certain types of carbon. You've got heat transfer, you've got air currents, you've got tectonic activity, air circulation patterns, the troposphere is involved. All those things are involved in this very complex world that is North America's climate. Now, also cooling temperatures are influenced by the opening of the North Atlantic Seaway into the Arctic Ocean. So for the first time, remember how we had that land bridge connection between Greenland and Northern Europe and North America? That now opens up. So these cooling waters that is the Arctic Ocean now spill over into the North Atlantic because those land bridges have been disconnected. And that spillage of cold water into the North Atlantic alters ocean currents, cooling them down more and more. Those currents don't stay there, right? Those cold waters get circulated to all parts of the ocean. So it's helping to cool down the planet by that circulation of cold water. Now, surface and ocean temperatures drop from the Eocene to the Oligocene. For example, surface temperatures drop by 12 degrees Celsius. Annual temperature range is broadened. We have distinct seasonality in places where we didn't have seasons before. In places like the Pacific Northwest, 3 to 5 degrees Celsius in the Middle Eocene, 25 degrees Celsius in the Oligocene. What that means is in the Pacific Northwest, like Oregon, Washington, there was no seasonality in the Eocene. It stayed within about a 3 to 5 degree temperature range. It was very warm, like you might expect parts of, let's say, central Mexico or southern Mexico to be. It's very equitable all year round. Very slight fluctuations in temperature. But by the next epoch in the Oligocene, you have 25 degree temperature fluctuations, right? The first hints of things like spring, summer, winter, and fall. You have substantial continued sea level lowering Here's why. We don't have glaciers yet at the North Pole, but we are seeing glacier ice formation on Antarctica. And as more ice builds up there, it drops global sea levels even more. And with that drop, you can expect that the high levels of the ocean that maybe would have drowned certain land bridges, with that drop, you're going to see the re-exposure of certain land bridges. Okay. And we also see a dramatic drying effect. 1,000 millimeters of rainfall, that's about 39 inches of rain in the late Eocene in South Dakota, which is already, we think of as a very dry region. 10 million years later, in the Oligocene, we're down to 10 inches of rain. That's almost desert conditions at 10 inches of rain. So we're going from 39 inches to 10 inches of rain. Those factors, that cooling and drying, is what is leading to worldwide grassland expansion. So let's concentrate on the east. Here we have the Eocene forests of the plains gave way to open savannas, except along rivers, which is where the forest would continue to grow down along the rivers. You do have some still tropical stuff way out on the very coast there, for example. And let's take a look at some of the, well, we're not going to look at the Oligocene floras. Why? Because there are essentially no Oligocene floras for the east. We do have Oligocene floras for the west, but there's very few Oligocene fossils for places here in the southeast. That's why we come to an abrupt end, and we have ended with the end of the Paleogene 20, what would we say, how many millions years ago? 24 million years ago. We now have hit the end of the Paleogene period, and we are ready to begin the Neogene.
Question.
Yes.
How come there's no fossils from plants from the Oligocene?
Well, one is, if you go back and look, it's in the previous slide deck from,
Okay.
well, for example, in Tennessee, Kentucky, there are no Oligocene sites known, period. Okay. There are Oligocene fossils in far south Alabama, but especially of animals. There's a real paucity of Oligocene flora from that region. And I don't know the exact explanation for that.
Huh.
Yeah, there's an abundance of Miocene, which we're going to get to next. Miocene fossils are really abundant, but Oligocene is not nearly as understood as the Eocene or the Miocene is.
Huh. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right. Who are we waiting on? We got everybody back? I think so. Well, let's get going. It's 6:41 on the nose. Let's talk about the Miocene, Pliocene. Actually, I'd like to change the, I'm going to be a perfectionist here. I'm going to change the, yeah, well, there we go. That's what I get for trying to be a perfectionist. I want to change this to Neogene, Miocene. I believe that's what, 24 million years ago to 5? Yeah. All right. All right, good. Helps to remember this stuff. All right. Excellent. Okay. Now we have entered a new geologic time period, the Neogene, and we got two epochs to deal with, right? The Miocene and the Pliocene. This first one spans from 24 million years to 5 million years ago. That's really not that far back in time. The Pliocene epoch is the shortest. You know, it's just really 5 up until about 2.5 million years. We'll get to next. Let's take a look at now the position of the Earth in terms of the various arrangements of the continents. Notice here that by this point, you know, we already talked about the uplift of the Himalayas and sort of the impact that all had. India is now firmly in place as part of Asia. We kind of skipped ahead a little bit, fast forward, I think, in focusing so much on what was happening with North America. We sort of didn't see some of the worldwide dynamics that were happening, let's say, with the split off from Australia and Antarctica. I want to make sure we talk about that real quick. All the other continents are more or less in their modern positions. Notice what's happening in Southern Europe right now. A lot of Southern and Central Europe is underwater as part of a broader sort of Mediterranean region, okay? A lot of the mountains that are what we think of today as the Alps have not risen yet. The Alps are a very young mountain range, and that's because Africa is still moving north, colliding into Southern Europe and building up the Alps. And that's what's going to cause Central Europe to go into more of a terrestrial landscape, restricting sort of all that ocean that you see there, covering parts of Western Russia, Ukraine, parts of Germany, et cetera. All that's going to be uplifted into a mountainous area. Then North and South America are more or less in their modern positions. And then you've got, notice that Central America is beginning to form and lengthen because of a lot of volcanic activity and also the drop in sea level. However, it is, as of this map is roughly showing at about 14 million years ago, there still is no connectivity directly with North and South America. That means that ocean currents can still flow from the Pacific into the Atlantic through that Isthmus of Panama region. Let's just take a minute and talk one more time and reinforce the steps that had to take place that led to the formation of the polar ice on Antarctica, because that's a real key world game changer, okay? So let's go back through that a little bit. Remember, if you step back into, say, the Paleocene, Eocene, remember during the Paleocene, Australia and Antarctica and Southern South America were all still connected as one continental landmass. The first of those to split away was Australia, okay? I don't remember the exact time frame, but roughly 35 million years ago, at the very close of the Eocene, beginning of the Oligocene, Australia pulls away entirely and becomes its own lone island continent, right? That's why Australia is so unique. Notice how all these other continents have had interchanges and land connections, right, into more recent times, but not Australia. It became disconnected and it stayed disconnected. So it has a very odd assemblage of plants and animals. So after Australia begins to break away, and it begins to drift east and north toward its modern position, for a time, Antarctica was still connected to the southern tip of South America, a region we know today as Tierra del Fuego or Patagonia. The fact that they still maintained a land bridge connection was very important because the ocean currents could not pass through a region because they were still connected. But when Antarctica pulled a little bit farther to the south, it disconnected from South America. And that meant that the ocean currents, which I'm going to show you a map of in a bit, ocean currents were rerouted and circulated. For the first time ever, the cold current, which flows south down from the Arctic, along the western coast of California and the western coast of South America, instead of being rerouted out, let's say, into the Pacific, it now routed through the Drake Passage, which is that real area of dangerous ocean or seas between this northern peninsula of Antarctica and southern tip of South America. The Drake Passage is a really dangerous stretch of water. When that happened, those cold currents were rerouted through that ocean pass for the first time in many, many millions of years. Those ocean currents then encircled Antarctica, and because Australia was not there to block it, then they went simply around and back. And then they went around and back and around and around and around and around and around and around. And what happened was that cold current settled around Antarctica and began to circle so that it maintained its own circumpolar, is what we would call that, circumpolar current. And that current is so strong that it precludes, let's say, some of the migratory fish and other kinds of marine life that may be in the adjacent South Atlantic or South Pacific. Those are functionally different oceans, largely in part because of the differences in ocean current and temperatures and so forth. So that cold water that begins to encircle Antarctica really drives the temperature down. And now keep in mind, it's also finally arrived at the true South Pole, right? Which means that there are long periods of winter darkness. And now ice is beginning to build up now this is not at 14 million years. Here you can see it's totally engulfed in ice, right? Antarctica is totally covered. We'd have to go back a couple of epochs back, probably the Paleocene or early Eocene, when we actually see a little patch of polar ice beginning to develop over Antarctica. It remains a small patch until South America disconnects from Antarctica. That's the nail in the coffin, right? That's what provides this critical feedback loop, which sort of presents this positive feedback loop, which adds more and more ice. And the more ice you have, the colder it gets. And the more ice you have, the colder it gets. The more ice you have, the colder it gets, right? All this is driven by this disconnect and the fact that you got this cold ocean current encircling Antarctica. So the ice cap builds to several thousand feet in thickness, and it swells to cover the entire continent of Antarctica, driving almost all of life to extinction, with the exception of those things which are exceedingly cold hardy, like various penguins, migratory birds, a couple of mosses, one or two flowering plants. That's it. The rest of Antarctica becomes a dead continent, but all of its fossils are still there. Buried under all that ice are the fossilized remains of once great tropical forests and dinosaurs. That's the frontier of discovery, is underneath the ice of Antarctica. Now, what happens in Antarctica, though, doesn't stay in Antarctica, right? Because what's happening in Antarctica is cooling down the rest of the planet. So remember, the Oligocene begins to drop in temperature, we said. We saw the real strong beginnings of seasonality beginning in the Eocene. What all this is doing, remember when we showed the vegetation patterns for North America, how it's sort of tropical down along Florida, Mexico, California? But we said by the time you get up to northern Canada, you were getting things like birch trees and maple trees. Like the deciduous forest was beginning to evolve out of tropical conditions. So naturally then, at the North Pole, where they also have winter darkness and so forth, we would expect then to see ice develop there as well, once the global temperatures drop to a certain level. And so by the time we get into Miocene, that's exactly what you see. You've got ice now developing over the Arctic Ocean and over parts of Greenland. By 14 million years ago, Greenland is essentially entirely encapsulated in Arctic ice. Okay, I wanted to really explain that whole process with Antarctica, because that's a major, major driver in terms of what's happening on a worldwide basis. This global cool down, when combined with global drying droughts, essentially, some of the most severe mega droughts you can imagine, combined with the fact that grasses have just evolved 20, 30 million years earlier, combined to make way for the world's greatest expansion ever of grassland ecosystems, all the world's continents. And you can see that reflected especially, well, not exceptionally. These maps are showing desert versus non-desert regions, but they're really not reflecting grasslands. In North America, most of North America became grassland. You know, today we think about large chunks of the East as being forest. A lot of Eastern North America in the Miocene was grassland. Europe, extensive grasslands. Ukraine, extensive grasslands. Russia, Central Asia, China, extensive grasslands. South America, Africa, Australia, extensive grasslands. Now, we still have land bridge connections. We still don't have the Central American land bridge connection, but up here with the Bering land bridge, I want you to take note, because after about 20 million years, that'll be the last time the Bering land bridge is connected for a long time. In fact, it's going to stay disconnected from the late Miocene all the way until we get to the ice ages. So that's important, because at the time that in the early Miocene, when that land bridge still exists between Russia and Russia and Alaska, there are forests across the Bering land bridge, or there are grasslands. But importantly, species like, you know, maple trees and sycamore trees can still go back and forth because it's still, you know, temperate conditions. Not when we get to the Ice Age. At that point, it becomes tundra. So these warm species that are adapted to farther southern latitudes, they can no longer go up and around the Bering Land Bridge, right? But what can? Not plants, but people and animals can, right? Big animals and humans, and we'll get back to that later. The North Atlantic Land Bridge will have a very tenuous, short-lived connection through Greenland into northern Russia. And again, we'll talk about the Central American Land Bridge in a bit. So this period spans 24 to 5 million years. This image, I think, perfectly encapsulates what a typical scene from the Miocene would have looked like. Very big animals. We had, you know, large relatives of elephants, rhinoceros, very large camels, some giraffe-like in size. Lots of horses. I mean, just many different genera of horses. Many genera of camels, hippopotamus relatives. We had tapirs. We had just all kinds of predators. Again, lots of big cats, relatives of saber-tooth and many others. Hyenas, many types of ancestors of canines, various dog groups. Just a lot of big animals and a bunch of big carnivores. It was very rich faunistically, just as rich as you could imagine the African Serengeti being, for example, today. Now, what is going on from a sort of a landform perspective? Well, we're almost building out North America at this point. The coastline continues to recede to the south. We're building up more of California out on the west coast. We've got the Rockies are in place. The Sierra Nevada mountains are now have been built. We've got a coastal plain forming. We've got the Great Plains. We've got forest in the Appalachians and probably forest in the Rockies, but a lot of grasslands in between. Okay. Now, something happens. Remember earlier I said that the Eocene and the Oligocene were periods of geologic quiescence, right? It was quiet. There wasn't any active mountain building. Something begins to happen, though, at 20 million years ago, 4 million years into the Miocene, that reverses all that. And we get a rapid uplift pulse, like a pulse of uplift that lasts from roughly 20 million years ago to probably about 4 or 5 million years ago, maybe 3 million years ago. So it goes from the Miocene into the Pliocene. Now, what could cause uplift based on what you can see from this map? Anything?
Are you asking how the Appalachians would have been lifted up?
Yeah, and it wasn't confined to the Appalachians. Basically, all of East Central North America. So Tennessee, probably the Ozarks of Arkansas, you know, Kentucky, Ohio, all up and down the Appalachians. They would have gone through another uplift period from 20 to about 3 million years ago. What caused it?
What's that term you gave us? Isostatic something?
Ooh, now you're thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, but what would have caused isostatic rebound?
Rebound. The absence of water or draining away of water or some kind of weight.
Right, but think about it though. We don't have any glaciers covering North America, right? There's no ice weight to get rid of. There's no oceans covering the eastern coast to get rid of.
But
right?
they're getting frozen.
Yeah, so good guess, but isostatic rebound is not the answer.
Okay.
Great guess though.
Glacier. Is it?
Ryan's asking about the Caribbean tectonic plate. Could that have some effect? Not to my knowledge. It could. It's largely moving to the east. You see the subduction zone right here on the eastern side of the Lesser Antilles. Yeah, here's the subduction zone here. Any other guesses? You basically have limited options. So let's go through the options. What's one? You could have continents colliding, like we did with Africa and North America. That's clearly not happening, right? Things are moving away still. You could have isostatic rebound, but we don't have any weights that we're shedding to rebound from. You possibly could have some other tectonic activities, but again, that kind of doesn't quite make sense.
Is it trying?
Not to my knowledge. I don't think there's any active rifting happening here. This will be just severed through, especially sea level rise, I'm sure. There may be some continental stuff going on up there. I don't think rifting's at play. So what else could it be?
Something about the ice caps.
Well, no ice caps in the northern hemisphere at 20 million years, right? There's no ice up there. Ah, so yeah, you're on the right track. So Ryan says maybe it's something to do with magma, right? Well, there's not any volcanic activity in the east at this time period. There's no volcanoes happening anywhere in the eastern US. But that still doesn't preclude magma below the continent from having an effect. Here's what current researchers, last I checked on this was a few years ago. So the belief is that there was a plume of magma underneath the eastern North American continent. And because magma is so dense as a molten metal, this giant plume, which would have been probably hundreds of miles across, was like a bubble pushing up, exerting force, upward force on the North American continent. And that upward uplift, because it's all floating on top of the asthenosphere, that upward push was enough to rejuvenate the Appalachian Mountains, which had been at this time eroding down, right? Think about it. Since Pangea broke apart, the Appalachians, which we all know is one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, was on its way to eroding down to its bare roots. But just in the nick of time, 20 million years ago, we see what's called rejuvenation. And these mountains begin to rise again, probably because of a mantle plume underneath the landscape. Now, we're going to come back and talk about that fairly extensively in the latter half of the class, because I'm going to talk, I have a whole lecture on biogeography. And believe it or not, part of the stuff we'll talk about involving that involves cave salamanders, spiders, a little group of fish called darters. They all sort of are things we're going to invoke as we look at this mantle plume hypothesis. Okay, let's move on. So the Appalachians had been eroding through this sort of quiet period. There was not a lot of uplift. So there was not a lot of rise until 20 million years ago. We've talked about that. The Rockies, though, undergo a second uplift. There's continued mountain building in the Rockies between about 12 million years, and again from 7 to 4 million years. The Sierra Nevadas, the Coast Range, which is that range of mountains right on the edge of California and Oregon, the Cascade Mountains of Washington and Oregon, and the Alaska Mountain Range, the Alaska ranges, have all risen within the last 10 million years. So those are really on the rise very recently. And they, notice how incised the western coast of America is, right? Very irregular. That's not what you see today. That western coastline is very straight. You can see the edge of it. All that sort of flat, low-lying, swampy ground is going to be lifted up continuously by these mountain building episodes that I'm talking about in that bullet point number 3, which means if you go to the coast of California today, you don't enjoy a nice, long coastal plain with swampy flats. You go right from mountains to sea, and it's deep as soon as you step off. You're stepping into an ocean trench, essentially, right off the coast of California. Okay. Miocene climate. The high mountains and the plateaus in the northern hemisphere, like the Rockies, the Himalayas, are continuing to deflect air masses, rerouting the jet stream southward, bringing colder polar air into the middle latitudes of North America, places like Kansas and Texas and Indiana. The Antarctic ice sheet has cooled the ocean waters, contributes to the spread of seasonally dry climates. Carbon dioxide and temperature levels continue to drop. Remember, CO2, temperature, they go hand in hand. When temperatures drop, CO2 is dropping. When temperatures rise, CO2 rises. That's why there's a danger of us putting too much CO2 in the atmosphere, because it will lead to temperature increase. We also have a lot more dust. Aeolian means wind blown. Aeolian dust increases. So we have things like dust deposition that's happening, blowing around. Ocean levels continue to drop by 40 to 50 meters. And remember how we talked about that area of Central Europe? Those waters are beginning to recede as the Alps are being built. We go through what's called the Mesnian salinity crisis. Essentially, the entire Mediterranean basin, the Mediterranean Sea, completely dries up. This leads to a decrease in ocean salinity by 6%. Seawater freezes at a higher temperature, creating more extensive sea ice and providing a positive feedback to the cooling trend in the Arctic. So something as simple as the drying of the Mediterranean, which affects ocean water salinity, causing the freezing temperature of the ocean to change, meaning it can freeze at a higher temperature, like maybe 34 degrees instead of 32, right? Or whatever. Then that leads to ice buildup more readily in the Arctic. You get more ice, you get colder temperatures. All of a sudden now, boom, in the Miocene, we have Arctic ice, in addition to South American Antarctic ice. You see what this is all building towards? We still have about 20 million years to go. We're going to hit the ice ages. And I want you to be thinking ahead. What is going to be that final nail in the coffin that's going to drive us from really warm Miocene, Pliocene conditions into the cold of the Ice Age? There's really like one thing that does it. We'll talk about it. Ice cover begins in late Miocene in the Arctic, roughly 6 to 5 million years ago. Very locally, there may have been glaciers on some of the high mountains of like the Brooks Range up near Fairbanks, Alaska. And there could have been some of these glaciers, like on mountain ranges, may date back into the Cretaceous. You would expect high mountains to have always had some ice, right? Let's talk a little bit about this connection between the Miocene faunas, the animal communities, with the coevolution of grasslands. At 6 million years ago, tooth enamel of ungulates, those animals that like to graze, for example, and this is based on using carbon isotopes. So you can check out the carbon ratios in the tooth enamel. For example, is it carbon 12 or carbon 14 isotopes? By studying those isotopes, it suggests that there's been a shift from plants that use C3 photosynthesis to those plants that use C4 photosynthesis. Remember the different photosynthetic pathways, C3, C4, and CAM photosynthesis. There's a shift from C3 to C4, suggesting a continued decline in carbon dioxide. More pronounced seasonality in rainfall, distinct dry seasons and wet seasons, and lower overall temperatures. So here's just a little bit. We don't have to get too deep into what we mean by C4, C3, but essentially plants that are in more arid conditions typically have a C4 photosynthetic pathway. That allows them to sort of process carbon dioxide to photosynthesize in ways that are more efficient. If you're in a less arid environment, like a lot of Appalachia, for example, with plenty of rainfall, you tend to have a C3 pathway of photosynthesis. If you're in a desert environment, you're like a succulent plant, you have yet a third pathway called CAM photosynthesis. And really all it means is your cellular structure, like the cross-section of the leaf, how you have your chloroplasts arranged and how you keep your stomata open to take in carbon dioxide and to utilize carbon is just different among these three plants, depending on if you live in a moist, dry, or desert-like environment, okay? So we see these shifts, and we can tell the difference between these plants by what type of carbon they have. And those carbons, and we don't have the remains of those plants anymore, right? Because they don't fossilize. But those carbon isotopes, when those animals graze on carbon, are carried into their teeth enamel. So we can take the tooth enamel and perform some chemical analyses and determine how much carbon 14 they have relative to carbon 12. And based on that, we can determine their dietary preferences. You know, we can tell whether they primarily fed on, if they grazed on grasses, then they were probably C4 plants, which means that they were a dry type environment. If they were had a higher richness of certain isotopes that indicate they browsed on leafy greens of broadleaf wildflowers, then maybe they were feeding primarily on a diet of C3 plants. Okay, so that tells you a little bit. That's just one form of evidence. It's not conclusive by itself. But when you couple it with the fossil record, we can study the enamel data, and it provides a very meaningful set of information. Now, at this time, about 2/3 of the new introductions into North America are coming from Asia. And that makes sense. The North Atlantic land bridge has closed by the sort of middle Miocene, but that Bering land bridge is still open. So we're seeing things like certain rodent groups, like the microtid rodents, flying squirrels, the lesser panda, things like the red panda, for example, which we have fossils of here in Tennessee. Brown bears, the grizzlies, essentially, come from Eurasia. We have elk, hyenas, rhinoceros, warthogs, peccaries, tortoises, and certain types of crocodilians in Nebraska are thought to have come over through this Miocene land bridge. Yeah. We're getting there, aren't we? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Excellent. So when we hit that 5 to 4 million year mark, as Chase was saying, let's not forget, right, that we have human evolution going on in Africa at this point, where the apes are evolving from their monkey ancestors, giving rise to various groups of apes. And between about 5 to 4 million years ago, we start seeing the branching off of various hominid ancestors, like Australopithecus, and what are some of those other ones? There's like yeah,
and still live in trees.
Still bipedal, but lives in trees. At about how long ago? 5.8 to 4.4 million years ago. So at the that's right. At this time, parts of Central Africa are beginning to become more savanna-like from a forest-like environment into grasslands. So a lot of researchers have speculated that sort of coming down out of the trees model, and I know that's debated by various paleoanthropologists, but that had a major, the evolution of the human species and our immediate ancestors was connected to the expansion of grasslands. One of the common talking points in the world of grasslands is that, we should love grasslands because we literally as a species evolved in grasslands. We evolved in savannas. So there is an innate evolutionary ingrained preference in many cases for living. Think about like your lawns, for example, right? Most people want to have a lawn with some grass with scattered shade trees. My friends, that's exactly what a savanna is. Scattered trees with some grass, you got the best of both worlds. Well, there could in fact be an evolutionary reason for that. Think about the openness factor, right? You feel like you're closed in a forest. You can see your enemies coming. You can see game, right? You can see danger. There's many reasons that anthropologists have studied as to why savannas and these open landscapes are probably evolutionarily part of our own history as a species. Now, this is probably a scene of what an artist rendering of what the Miocene would have looked like from Nebraska. This is a fossil site called the ash beds, and there are multiple species here. 5 species of horses are preserved in these volcanic ash deposits. There's also multiple species of rhinoceros. There's zebra present in Nebraska, as well as camels. This is about 10 million years ago when there were major volcanic eruptions from Idaho that deposited 3 meters of ash as far away as Nebraska. And so you can see these watering holes with some of these big animals, horses, rhinoceros, zebras, camels, all enjoying parts of the modern day Great Plains. Here's some of those rhinoceros fossils in Nebraska. a very famous paleontological site. I'll just rapidly show you some of the animals of the Miocene. Again, lots of different horse variation at this time. Some of them zebra-like, camels and their relatives, lots of types of deer and antelopes, elk and relatives, rhinoceros of many kinds, lots of different types of canids and dog relatives, many kinds of birds, a lot of land tortoises, some large, some small. When it comes to understanding the Miocene, a lot of this, again, comes from the West because we don't have a lot of Miocene sites in the East anymore because we don't have a lot of Miocene age rock. So a lot of rich stuff. And if you want to be a paleontologist studying this time period, many of the Western programs, are probably schools that you would go to study those. But here in the East, we do have a little bit of Miocene up around Connecticut, New Jersey, here in Northeast Tennessee, a site I'll tell you about hopefully today toward the end of lecture, and Florida. Florida's got a very rich Miocene collection of Miocene fossils near Gainesville, Florida. Some of the best in North America. In fact, some of the sites in Florida are really spectacular. They have pronghorn antelope, and they have cheetahs, which are really cool. Let's take a look at Miocene vegetation. There's a lot going on here. At this time period, we've got several major types of ecosystems. I'm going to call out the basic ecosystems first, okay? Here in the South, we've got a lot of pine, woodlands, and savannas. Again, there are no people in North America at 10 million, 5 million, 2 million years ago, right? We don't get humans here on this continent until anywhere from 50,000 to 25,000 years ago. So this predates humans in North America before the evolution of humans still. So we have fire-dominated pine lands and savannas. We have, as you would expect, also like around the southern coast, we have some tropical things like mangroves still that are holdovers from the Oligocene, Eocene. As you move a little bit further north, you're beginning to see a lot of the things that we still have today: oaks and hickories and chestnuts, elm trees and sassafras trees, right? Very common in parts of the East. If you get way up into Canada, again, cool temperate forests, birches, maples, basswoods, those kind of things. Out on the West Coast, lots of variation going. We don't have to spend too much time, but suffice it to say we have a lot of scrub land like you might see in Southern California, parts of Arizona. We have Western coniferous forests like lodgepole pine forests that are so prevalent in parts of the Rockies today. But what do we not have too much of? Well, we don't know a lot about what the floras were of the grasslands because they didn't fossilize very well. We don't have a lot of knowledge about the deserts because they didn't fossilize very well, right? Think about what's fossilizing, stuff that's in low, swampy, wetland environments. So the dry sites or the desert sites or the upland mountain sites, we don't know anything about those because those simply do not fossilize. So hopefully you can get an appreciation for how much extrapolation is required to reconstruct the paleovegetation of these regions and the paleofauna. Any questions about that? Now, I'm not going to go through all this, but if you want to read long lists of species, Jared, who's my grad student, who's formerly in this class, I mean, he would just get a kick out of reading all this stuff, right? He would sphagnum, osmunda, aves, larynx, he would just be getting all hyped up on that stuff. So read that if you want. I encourage you to. It is important to realize a lot of these we currently have here in the Southeast today. But there are still holdovers from Asian tropical species. For example, Pterocarya. That's the Asian hickory. We don't have Pterocarya anymore. They became extinct in North America sometime in the late Miocene to Pliocene. So what we're going to begin to see then is we're losing those Asiatic tropical elements to extinction completely. One thing I do want to point out is that it's estimated that true prairie, like in the Great Plains, had formed by around 15 to 12 million years ago. So if that's the case, then, you know, how old were the grasslands that extended into Tennessee or into Kentucky or Alabama? We don't have fossils of those, so we can only extrapolate. But if we look at the animals that I'm going to keep talking to you about over the next, through the rest of class, I think you'll begin to see we had some amazing animals that testify to the widespread presence of grasslands. Things like pronghorn in Florida, cheetahs in Virginia. All right, let's take just a quick look very fast. Again, out on the West Coast, the western edge where it's kind of swampy along the Pacific Ocean, that's all changing rapidly, right? But we have the floras, we have the fossils to document what those conditions were like before those West Coast floodplain species were driven to extinction. So in places like Clarkia, Idaho, for example, check out some of the fossils we've got. Here's a tulip poplar. We have these growing on campus today, our state tree. It looks exactly like the tulip poplars that are alive here today. There's a magnolia cone in the upper right. There's a sassafras leaf in the bottom left. That's a sweet gum in the bottom center. All of these are trees that we still have around. Here's a maple, for example, in the bottom right. On the left is a beech tree. On the right is a chestnut leaf. They look exactly identical to some of the modern representatives. Are they the same species? Probably not. They're probably very close related ancestral species that are today extinct, but they could be the same. On the far left and center is a willow, the leaves of a willow. Looks very much like the black willow that we have today. And there on the right are the fruiting capsules of willows. Here we have things like sweet leaf, which is a rare type of little shrub in Tennessee today, common in New York and New England. Looks identical to the modern type. And here, anybody who's walked through the woods knows what we call the blaspheme vine. It'll make you cuss because they'll get stuck in your fingers and they'll cut you. This is what we call greenbrier or smilax. And there's multiple species. These look exactly identical to some of the modern species living here in the Southeast, but where are they from? Idaho, where there are no greenbriers today, no tulip poplars, no beeches, no chestnuts, no sweet gums today. So what happened to all those things? It was the successive rise of first the Rockies, then the Sierra Nevadas, and then the coast mountain ranges, which led to the drying out of all the West Coast. So that great deciduous forest, remember we said that back in the late Eocene and early Oligocene, stretched all the way across the continent, became severed and fractured into an eastern deciduous forest and a western deciduous forest. We still have ours, but not, they largely have lost theirs because of the uplift of those mountains right on the coastal edge. It drove all those western deciduous forest species, and think about all the animals that would have lived in those western deciduous forests. It mostly drove them to extinction, except in just a few areas. Still today, north of San Francisco and in southwesternmost Oregon, is the greatest concentration of temperate deciduous forest species in North America, except for in the east. So if you want to see many of the species we have, let's say in the Smokies, you can go see their close relatives out in Northern California. Here's one example. This is a very rare shrub we actually have called out in the botanical garden called the Alabama snow wreath, shown on the right. This is a species that was discovered in 1857 near modern-day Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And then for the next 150 years, it was found in just a few counties across the Central South, no more than about 20 populations on Earth. And that was the only species that we knew of in existence in the world, was one species of the genus Neviusia alabamensis. And then in the 1990s, a group of California botanists were from UC Berkeley and left San Francisco, were driving north up in California towards the town of Redding, California, toward Mount Shasta. And as they went, they passed by a river that normally was swollen due to snow melt coming off of the Sierra Nevadas. And they said, you know what, man, it's dry this year. That river is normally flooded. Why don't we get out and walk up that hollow? And I'm sure they talk just like that in California, right? Let's get up and walk up that hollow over there. And so they got out and they walked up in this canyon, and it was limestone. Now that's significant because the West Coast, California, has almost no limestone. So they get out and they're like, whoa, look here, Judy. Look here, Barb. There really was a lady by the name Barb on the trip. Look here, Barb. There's limestone here. And then they found this shrub just dripping off the cliff faces and the boulders. You know, what is this thing? And it was in flower. And it had these spectacular flowers with all these stamens and these really funny little leaves with deeply serrated margins. They took it back and they tried to identify it in their plant manuals, and there was nothing. They couldn't come up with anything in all of California or the entire West Coast that it could be. So what did they do? They sent a specimen to Japan, to a Japanese botanist. They knew it was in the rose family. They sent a specimen to a Japanese botanist who specializes in the rose family, and they said, sir, can you help us here and give us some ideas what this could be? He comes back and he says, it's nearest to Nevusia alabamensis, which is a monotypic species, meaning it's the only one of its genus, and it only occurs in the southeastern United States, 1,000 miles away. So it turns out they discovered a brand new species on that day, which became known as Nevusia cliftonii. It's endemic to one county near the base of Mount Shasta, California. This was in like 1997. A couple of years later, some paleobotanists working in southeastern British Columbia, Canada, in the Okanagan Highlands, were digging through some fossils from the late Eocene, when all of a sudden they uncovered some leaves, and they're like, man, we don't know what this thing is. They started comparing. It turns out it's a fossil Nevusia, a transitional fossil, likely from an ancestor of both of these species at a time, remember, when the eastern forests were connected all the way across to the West Coast. So this genus Nevusia is a perfect example of that fracturing that occurred, largely being driven by uplift of mountains, development of rain shadows. And that's the same genus with two sister species that are probably separated in time by 40 to 50 million years of evolution. And look at how essentially identical they look. It's pretty wild, right? I want to get a Shasta snow wreath for our garden because I do grow the Alabama snow wreath out there. I would like to have that as a nice talking point. Okay, we talked about what happened to that West Coast flora. With that, let's enter the Pliocene, okay? Well, I wish you would. I'm getting tired of all this tertiary, Neogene. I want to get on to the Quaternary. Hey, y'all, just be patient, man. We're going to get there, okay? Be patient, Kian. We're on our way. The Pliocene is the shortest epoch yet, just 2.5 million years, spanning from 5 to 2.5 million years ago. Notice that we have a lot of big animals still. It's very warm, but it's cool relative to the Eocene, right? We've been going through this steady cool down, even though it's warmer than it is today. All right, so y'all look at me right here. We got real hot during the Eocene, goes to cooler and drier in Oligocene, continue cool and dry during the Miocene, continue cool and dry, but it gets warmer and it kind of gets wet in the Pliocene. And then we go through a dramatic cool down during the Ice Age. But the Ice Age gives us occasionally these periods of warmth. So we go through warm and cold, into the modern day. But it was still, even though it was cool in the Pliocene, it was still warmer than it is today. Okay, so I want you to think about that from a context. How warm was it? Well, East Tennessee had alligators. East Tennessee had a whole host of animals we think about associated with warm environments. One of the more notable ones is what my colleague, Dr. Chris Ginger, is known for studying. Who knows what animal Dr. Ginger studies more than any? What is it? The Gila monsters, right? Native to the desert Southwest. Those are called heliodermatid lizards because of their sort of a really strongly scaly skin. We had those heliodermatid lizards. It probably wasn't the same Gila monster species, but it was an ally. We also had tortoises, land tortoises in East Tennessee. So we had warm conditions here that are warmer than today. Now, so at 5.5 to basically 5 to 2.5 million years ago, remember we talked about the final nail in the coffin that drives us into the ice age? We finally arrived. And what is it? It's the closure of the Isthmus of Panama. Volcanic activity and tectonic activity finally lead to a coalescence, right? Those volcanic islands in Nicaragua and Panama, Costa Rica, they begin to coalesce together to form one land unit. That then leads to a permanent disconnect between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Now, various people who study population genetics or phylogeography have studied the animal populations in the sea on both sides of the Isthmus of Panama. And you can actually date using molecular dating approaches like a molecular clock. You can date things like crabs on one side of the Isthmus of Panama versus the other, or oysters on one side versus the other, or certain fish groups on one side versus the other. And they all tell the same story, that about 3 to 3.5 million years ago is when those lineages all bifurcated and became separated by the closure of that isthmus. Now, when that happened, there was warm water that was flowing between North and South America. That warm water current got redirected. Instead, then, as you can see, it was not able to go through. And that's what really then led to this change right here, which is sort of that the final blow, was some of the ocean current changes here. And notice here's that circumantarctic current, right, going all the way around. This is already fully involved in ice. But it's really this change right here, which directed warm water toward Europe and led cold air to flow down this west coast, changing the global ocean conveyor system. And so the reds you can see are the warm currents and the blues are the cold currents. And this led to a bunch of temperature changes in the northern hemisphere. There was already polar ice at both poles, north and south. But this was the final nail in the coffin that led to full-blown glacial conditions beginning to develop at the end of the Pliocene. Okay? Here's what it looked like sort of about 3 million years ago. As soon as that Isthmus of Panama connected, we see rapid ice development over Greenland. That ice begins to expand onto adjacent islands of northern Canada, like Ellesmere Island and Baffin Island. We see glacial ice beginning to develop in the mountains of Alaska. Now, at this time, sea levels is still higher than it is at present. It was about 35 meters higher than today, which means that most of Florida was underwater, and very southernmost edges down here are underwater. But what basically have we sort of arrived at? We've arrived at nearly the modern day North American continent. Well, good God, it just took us 2 months to get here. Well, okay, just hang tight. Hang tight. The formation of the Bering Strait happened about 3.4 million years ago. The Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and the Coast Ranges all are continuing to build up, drying out the western part of America. And we've got this spread of glacial ice in the Arctic. But that fusion of North and South America began what's called the Great American Interchange. We see the introduction of a lot of big animal groups into the southern hemisphere, like bears, horses, mountain lions, camels, which would eventually go on to become alpacas and llamas in South America. Various pig family members like peccaries, and members of the elephant family, like mammoths and mastodons. They all migrate into South America. What do we get in exchange? We get a bunch of piddly little animals like opossums and armadillos and members of the anteater family and porcupines. Yeah, the porcupines of Michigan and Canada came from South America. Largely, we gave them a bunch of big animals and a bunch of carnivores, which went into South America and destroyed and drove to extinction their biggest animals. So our mountain lions and our dire wolves went down there and pounced on their biggest land animals and killed them and drove them to extinction. We also see the exchange of marsupials. We got opossums from South America, which they had in turn gotten from Antarctica, which they had gotten from Australia. And we see terror birds, these giant flightless birds that can run at 30, 40 miles an hour. They peck a horse in the neck at a full gallop, break its neck in stride, stomp on the horse, use its eagle-like beak to like hold the horse down with its big old foot, and reach down and just take a big old chunk of hide up out of the horse and eat it and devour it. Terror birds, as big as I am, as tall as I am. Run down a horse, pop, break its neck by just pecking it on the neck in full stride. It was a dangerous place. You wouldn't want to live in Gainesville, Florida, in the Pliocene. Let's talk a little bit about Pliocene climate. Again, significantly warmer than at present, about 3.5 degrees Celsius warmer. You know, some people say we're on a path to go up by a couple of degrees, right? So we may get back to Pliocene temperatures, you know, within 100 to 150 years. I don't know the exact ranges, but you know, we could get there, and not in our lifetime probably, but you know, if we see the total collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet, you know, it might be possible. Carbon dioxide levels are at about their approximate levels. They were higher than they are today. They're about where they are now. We do see seasonal ice in the Arctic Ocean because of winter darkness. There's winter temperatures on Baffin Island, for example, are 20 to 22 degrees warmer than they are today, way up in the northern latitudes. And that's where a lot of our climatologists fear, is that the temperature extremes will be especially felt in the Arctic, right? Northern Canada and parts of Russia, Alaska, they're going to feel it first, especially. The Greenland ice sheet forms about 3.2 million years ago. By the end of the Pliocene, we got more moisture. It's less dry. It's getting moisture. And finally, by 2.6 million years, which is literally the tipping point, that's the beginning of the ice age, where this big ice sheet begins to cover North America. We call that the Laurentide ice sheet. Begins to form at 2.6 million years as a result of the cooling brought on by the closure of the Isthmus of Panama. Shortly thereafter, about 2.4 million years ago, we had the first permafrost in North America, frozen soil. That's what forms tundra, right? And then between 2.4 and 2.1 million years, perennial ice, meaning all year round, finally is at both poles. I got 4 minutes. I'm going to do a quick tour, and then we'll pick it up next time with a story of our only Pliocene fossil site in Tennessee. What are some new immigrants coming from South America? We talked about some: sloths, armadillos, porcupines. We've got some vegetation change. I'll pick up a little bit on this next time. Here's some great fossils of Pliocene sites. I mean, some of these, like the sweet gum, and this looks like cherry bark oak. Here's looks like river birch. That's probably a mockernut hickory. Those are all probably modern species. That's a real significant thing. They're either the same species that we have today, or they're very close cousins that we can't tell apart. So that's, for the first time in the whole history of the planet, we finally arrived at a point where the plants are probably some of the same species that we still have with us. That's a real key milestone. When we pick it up next time, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to tell you guys about an incredible discovery made when I was in my first days of community college as a lowly two-time dropout. I read an article in the Tennessee Conservationist magazine, which really inspired me to take interest in this stuff at kind of that age. But it details, and I'm going to tell you the story when we come back on Tuesday, the discovery of this very prominent site that is today part of the campus of East Tennessee State University. It led them to having one of the most notable fossil sites for the late Miocene and Pliocene in America. And they now have a Center for Paleontology, Center of Excellence for Paleontology, just like we have here at Austin Peay, a Center of Excellence for Field Biology. So if you're interested in paleontology and merging some of the topics we've talked about with geology and botany and studies of animals, this is a great place to go seek a degree. They have some great scholars. This is located off campus at the fossil site, and that's what we'll pick up next week. And that's a look from above at the fossil site. Anybody know the first whole animal that they found on the site? Anybody know what that is? It's a rhinoceros. Yeah. Yeah. It's from about 7 million years ago, right at the end of the Miocene. Okay, gang, any questions in our final 2 minutes? You probably had enough of my droning on and on. Any questions from anybody online?
All good here.
Excellent. Thank you all. Y'all have a good night. Be prepared next week, guys. Oh, by the way, keep reading. Make sure you're reading. Make sure, dang it, you know those epochs, periods, and eons or whatever, eras, periods, and epochs. Read, read, read. Go ahead and keep reading. I'm going to send you out a reminder of another block of text to be reading. Let's see. And then we'll cover the probably first 15 minutes or 20 minutes or so, maybe 30 minutes next time, finishing the Pliocene. And then the entire probably rest of the class next week will be covering the Ice Age. Okay. And then Thursday, we'll start human history. We'll talk about the migration of Native Americans into this continent, and we'll pick it up from there. Thanks, guys.